I stood in the grand foyer of our family estate, watching my father hand the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire over to my brother. He looked me dead in the eye in front of 300 guests and announced that as a woman, I was getting absolutely nothing. I was 35 years old, the financial brains behind the entire operation, and I had just been publicly erased. But they had no idea that a stranger was already waiting outside in the pouring rain, holding a sealed envelope that would reduce their stolen kingdom to ash. Before I tell you how I dismantled my own family's empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who they are dealing with. The air inside the Washington estate was thick with the scent of expensive catered food and the low, perfect harmonies of the megachurch choir singing in the corner. It was the repast for my grandfather, Jeremiah Washington. He was a legend, a man who had built a massive logistics and real estate empire from the red clay of Atlanta all the way up to the glittering high-rises of Buckhead. The sprawling foyer was packed wall to wall with the black elite of the city. Politicians, prominent pastors, and wealthy socialites were all dressed in custom morning attire, sipping sweet tea from crystal glasses and whispering about the future of the Washington fortune. My name is Chloe, and for the last 10 years I had been the invisible engine keeping that very fortune intact. I am a forensic accountant and a private wealth manager. While my father, Bishop Ezekiel Washington, spent his days preaching prosperity from the pulpit of his 10,000-member church, I was the one sitting in boardrooms. I negotiated the warehouse acquisitions, balanced the corporate books, and structured the tax shelters that kept our family dripping in generational wealth. I stood near the back of the room, my feet aching in my heels, exhausted from weeks of managing both the intricate funeral arrangements and the daily corporate crises. Suddenly, my father raised his glass and tapped it with a silver spoon. The choir instantly faded out. The murmurs of the wealthy guests died down, replaced by an expectant silence. Ezekiel stood on the landing of the grand sweeping staircase, his tailored suit projecting absolute, unquestionable authority. He cleared his throat, performing his grief perfectly for the captive audience. "We are gathered here to honor a giant," he projected, using that booming, melodic pastor voice that could command thousands every Sunday morning. My father Jeremiah built a legacy that feeds this community and provides for this family. But as many of you know, he departed this world suddenly. And it pains me to share that my father, a man of such great vision, died intestate. He left no recorded will. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of dignitaries. I frowned, my grip tightening on the heavy leather-bound financial ledger I had been holding against my chest. I knew for an absolute fact that Grandpa Jeremiah possessed a brilliant, meticulous legal mind. He trusted no one blindly, not even his own blood. He would never leave his life's work completely unprotected. But my father was already continuing, his voice swelling with practiced dramatic emotion. "As his only living son, the state recognizes me as the sole inheritor of the Washington estate," Ezekiel declared, placing a hand over his heart. "However, a bishop's place is shepherding his flock, not managing warehouses and supply chains. Therefore, I am officially passing the mantle today." He turned and gestured grandly to his right. My brother Julian stepped forward into the light, adjusting his designer tie with a smug, entitled grin plastered across his face. Julian was 32 years old, a man who had spent his entire adult life coasting effortlessly on the prestige of our last name. My father pulled a heavy ceremonial set of brass keys from his pocket, the symbolic keys to the corporate headquarters. With immense pride, I named my son Julian Washington, the new CEO and sole heir to the Washington logistics empire, Ezekiel announced. The applause from the crowd was deafening. I felt all the blood drain from my face, replaced instantly by a hot, rising, uncontrollable fury. My own father was handing a multi-million-dollar enterprise to a man who possessed zero business acumen simply because he was born a son. I pushed through the crowd of clapping deacons and politicians, ignoring the shocked looks of my aunts and cousins, as I marched straight to the bottom of the staircase. I slammed the heavy financial ledger onto a marble display table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, cutting the applause dead in an instant. The room grew so quiet, you could hear the heavy rain starting to lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the silence. "Julian is the sole heir. You are handing the keys to a man who could not even manage the budget for his fraternity's charity car wash without me bailing him out." Julian's arrogant smile vanished. His face flushed with deep embarrassment as the high society guests exchanged wide-eyed, shocked whispers. "Chloe." My father warned, his tone dropping a full octave into something dangerous and cold. "Do not embarrass this family today. You are embarrassing grandfather's legacy," I shot back, taking a step up the stairs to look them both directly in the eye. "I am not going to stand here and be quiet to protect your ego. I have run the financial operations of this entire enterprise for a decade. I secured the downtown real estate deals. Julian has spent the last 10 years partying in VIP sections on the company credit card, while I stayed up until 3 in the morning, fixing his catastrophic mistakes and keeping us out of audits. You cannot just hand my life's work to someone who does not even know how to read a balance sheet." My father looked down at me, his eyes hard and unyielding, stripping away any lingering illusion of paternal love. He leaned over the banister, making absolutely sure his voice carried to every influential ear in the grand foyer. "A woman's place is not at the head of the Washington table, Chloe," he said slowly, ensuring each word cut as deeply as possible. "You are meant to support, not to lead. The fact that you would disrespect your own brother on the day we lay your grandfather to rest shows exactly why you lack the temperament for leadership. You will not get a single cent of this estate. Julian is the heir. It is final." I stood there, the sheer weight of his misogyny and betrayal crashing over me. 10 years of my life, my loyalty, my brilliant financial maneuvering, entirely erased in a single sentence, simply because I was a daughter. I opened my mouth to tear his ridiculous argument apart, fully prepared to demand he open the corporate books right there in front of the mayor and the church board to prove exactly who generated their wealth. But before I could utter a single word to defend myself, a high-pitched, drippingly sweet voice echoed from the top of the sweeping staircase. It was a voice that never quite fit in with our family, no matter how hard it tried to forcefully insert itself. Everyone looked up to see Julian's white wife stepping out of the shadows and into the chandelier light. Brittany descended the marble steps with the practiced, delicate tread of someone who desperately wanted to belong to a world that intimidated her. She wore a black designer morning dress that cost more than my first car, purchased, of course, with the company credit card I managed. In her manicured hands, she carried an object so violently out of place in this room of crystal and silk that it took my brain a moment to register what it was: a bulk box of heavy-duty industrial garbage bags. The silence in the grand foyer grew absolutely suffocating. The deacons, the local politicians, the socialites all watched in muted horror as Brittany reached the bottom of the stairs. She stopped right beside my father, who did not offer a single word of correction. She held the box out to me, a sickeningly bright smile plastered across her face. "Julian and I are moving into the primary master suite tonight, Chloe," Brittany announced, making sure her voice carried to the back of the room. "We have decided to do some immediate renovations to the property to better suit our tastes. We need you out of the guest house by tomorrow morning. I know it is a tight turnaround, but you are so organized. I brought these to help you pack." I stared at the cardboard box, then at her face. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her action was breathtaking. This was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, a woman who spent her weekends awkwardly trying to police the tone and culture of our family gatherings, now standing in my grandfather's house, handing me trash bags. "Do not look so gloomy," Brittany continued, her tone shifting to a mockingly sympathetic pitch. "I know losing your position here feels like a big blow, but I will totally write you a glowing recommendation for a bookkeeping job somewhere else. My uncle runs a mid-sized dental practice. They always need girls to manage the front desk ledgers. I can put in a good word. Just do not ask us to pay off those massive student loans you took out for your fancy accounting degrees. Julian got his tuition paid in full in cash because he is the heir, But you are a smart girl. You will figure out how to pay your own debts. I shifted my gaze from Brittany to my brother. Julian stood slightly behind her, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He let out a low, cowardly chuckle. He refused to look me in the eye. He stared firmly at the intricate patterns of the oriental rug beneath our feet, perfectly content to let his wife do the dirty work. He was fully backing her humiliation tactic with his silence. The golden boy of the Washington family, the man I had covered for, cleaned up after, and protected for an entire decade, was watching me be thrown away like yesterday's garbage. The rage burning inside my chest suddenly turned to solid ice. I realized in that exact moment that fighting them in this room would give them the exact spectacle they craved. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry. They wanted to prove my father right, to show everyone that I was just an emotional, unstable woman unfit for the corporate throne. I reached out and snatched the box of garbage bags from Brittany's hands. I maintained absolute composure. I smoothed the front of my black dress, adjusted my posture until I stood taller than both of them, and offered a smile so cold it made Brittany physically take a step backward. I will be gone before sunrise. I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of the devastation they hoped to inflict. Congratulations on your inheritance, Julian. You are going to need every ounce of luck you can find. I turned my back on my father, my brother, and his wife. I walked straight through the crowd of gaping guests. Not a single person moved to stop me. Not one aunt, not one uncle, not one church elder who had watched me sacrifice my youth to build the very wealth they were currently drinking. I pushed open the massive double oak doors of the estate and stepped out into the brutal, punishing storm. The rain was coming down in sheets, instantly soaking my hair and ruining my tailored suit. But I did not run. I walked with deliberate, measured steps across the sprawling, manicured lawns toward the guest house. Thunder rattled the windows of the main estate behind me, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. When I reached the guest house, I did not waste a single second. I tore open the box Brittany had handed me and pulled out the thick black plastic bags. I threw open my closet doors and started stuffing my clothes, my files, my life into them. The guest house had been my sanctuary for 5 years. It was where I spent countless sleepless nights auditing supply chain vendors, fighting tax liabilities, and ensuring the Washington Empire expanded across the East Coast. Now it was just another property I was being evicted from. I dragged the heavy bags out to the driveway. The wind whipped rain across my face, blinding me as I popped the trunk of my reliable sedan. I hurled the plastic bags inside, followed by 2 large suitcases containing my most vital documents and personal belongings. I was soaked to the bone, shivering violently from the cold and the adrenaline crashing through my system. Everything I had worked for, my legacy, my financial security, my rightful place in the family hierarchy, had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. I slammed the trunk shut. The metallic thud echoed loudly over the drumming rain. I walked around to the driver's side, opened the door, and slid into the leather seat. I was shivering, wiping the rainwater from my eyes as I stared at the dark, imposing silhouette of the main estate through my windshield. The warm yellow light spilled from the massive windows, illuminating a family that had just cut off its most vital organ and celebrated the amputation. I reached out with trembling fingers and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life. My headlights cut a bright, piercing path through the heavy curtain of rain, illuminating the long, winding driveway that led to the main gates. I shifted the car into drive, ready to leave the Washington compound forever. Just as my foot touched the gas pedal, a massive shadow glided out from the tree line. A sleek, pitch-black town car rolled smoothly across the wet asphalt, stopping dead in the center of the driveway. It completely blocked my path to the exit. I slammed on the brakes, my tires skidding slightly on the slick pavement. I stared through the rain-lashed windshield, my heart pounding in my chest. No one moved. The tinted windows of the town car revealed absolutely nothing. I gripped the steering wheel, bracing myself, wondering if my father had sent security to confiscate my vehicle too. Then the driver's side door of the town car slowly swung open. The heavy sheet of rain pounded against the roof of my sedan like a drumline. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned ash white. I stared through the rhythmic slashing of the windshield wipers at the sleek black town car blocking my exit. My first thought was deeply cynical but entirely logical given the last hour of my life. My father had sent security to seize my vehicle. After all, the car was in my name, but the insurance and maintenance were tied to the corporate account. Ezekiel Washington was a man who preferred complete annihilation over a simple victory. He wanted me to walk out of these gates with absolutely nothing, not even a reliable mode of transportation. I kept the engine running, my foot hovering over the brake. If whoever was in that town car wanted my keys, they were going to have to break the glass to get them. I had spent 10 years generating the capital that paid for the asphalt we were parked on, and I refused to be stripped of my dignity in the mud. The driver's side door of the town car swung open. A large, imposing silhouette stepped out into the blinding glare of my headlights. The man did not rush. He did not flinch against the freezing downpour. He moved with a terrifying, calculated grace, popping open a large black umbrella that shielded his face. He walked slowly toward my driver's side window, his polished Oxford shoes splashing deliberately through the puddles. As he stepped out of the blinding beam of the headlights, the ambient glow from the estate illuminated his face. My breath caught in my throat. It was not a security guard. It was not one of Julian's frat brothers trying to earn brownie points. It was Silas Montgomery. Silas was not a mere employee of the Washington Empire. He was the ghost in the machine. He was Grandpa Jeremiah's most trusted confidant, a ruthlessly efficient private fixer who handled everything from silencing corporate blackmail to erasing high-profile scandals before they ever hit the Atlanta news desks. Silas was a man who knew exactly where every single body was buried, because he was usually the one holding the shovel. Even my father feared Silas. Ezekiel's loud, boisterous megachurch persona always shrank whenever Silas entered a room because Silas dealt purely in facts, not faith. I rolled my window down just a few inches. The freezing rain immediately whipped across my face, stinging my cheeks, but I did not blink. I locked eyes with him through the narrow gap. "If my father sent you to collect the keys to this car, Silas, you can go back inside and tell him to call the police." I said, my voice steady, despite the violent shivering in my shoulders. "I am leaving, and I am taking the car." Silas stopped right outside my door. He did not look hostile. He did not possess the arrogant, gloating sneer that Julian and Brittany had worn. Instead, he looked at me with profound, unspoken respect. He slowly turned his head to look past my car, staring up at the massive, brightly lit windows of the main estate. We could both see the silhouettes of the guests inside drinking and laughing, completely oblivious to the injustice that had just occurred in their presence. "Your father did not send me," Chloe Silas said, his deep baritone easily cutting through the noise of the storm. "And your father does not own me. He never has." He stepped closer, angling his umbrella so that it shielded my open window from the rain. The sudden barrier against the storm created a small, intimate pocket of silence between us. "I watched them do it," Silas continued, his eyes snapping back to mine. "I stood in the back of the foyer and watched Ezekiel hand a dynasty to a boy who cannot even tie his own shoelaces without a corporate handler. I watched that entitled woman hand you garbage bags, and I watched you maintain your absolute composure. You did not scream, you did not break, you walked out with your spine straight." I swallowed hard, fighting the sudden dangerous urge to cry. Being seen, truly seen, after being rendered entirely invisible by my own blood was almost too much to bear. "Composure is all I have left, Silas," I replied, my voice tight. "They took everything else. 10 years of my life. The late nights balancing the ledgers, the audits I navigated while Julian was sleeping off hangovers. It is gone." Silas shook his head slowly. The rain drummed heavily against the fabric of his umbrella. "Jeremiah knew exactly what would happen the moment his heart stopped," Silas said softly. "He built this empire from the dirt, Chloe. He was a brilliant man. Do you honestly believe a man with his intellect would die without leaving specific ironclad instructions for his legacy?" Do you truly believe he would let Ezekiel turn his life's work into a personal piggy bank? My brow furrowed. I stared at Silas, my mind racing. Ezekiel just announced to 300 people that Grandpa died intestate. I said, the confusion mounting. The lawyers verified it. There was no will on file at the corporate office. That is because the corporate lawyers work for whoever sits in the big chair, Silas replied smoothly. And Jeremiah knew Ezekiel would run straight to them. He knew Ezekiel loved the spotlight too much to share it. He knew Julian loved the lifestyle too much to earn it. And he knew that you, Chloe, were the only one who respected the grind. Silas reached inside his tailored waterproof trench coat. He did not pull out a repossession order or an eviction notice. He pulled out a thick, heavy, cream-colored envelope. He held it out toward the narrow opening of my window. I stared at the envelope. It was not sealed with a standard corporate stamp. It was sealed with dark crimson wax pressed heavily with the original Washington family crest. It was my grandfather's personal private seal, the one he only used for matters of absolute unbreakable trust. I could see the distinct rectangular outline of a digital flash drive pressing against the thick paper from the inside. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "This is the actual succession plan." Silas answered, his eyes locking onto mine with fierce intensity. The display in there tonight was just theater. It was a trap set by a dead man to see who would show their true colors when the money was on the table. They took the bait, Chloe. Every single one of them. I reached out through the cold rain, my trembling fingers grasping the heavy envelope. The crimson wax felt cool and solid against my skin. The sheer weight of the paper felt like holding a loaded weapon. "You are the only Washington who knows the cost of building an empire," Silas said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register. "Jeremiah trusted you to protect it from the parasites. He told me to wait until Ezekiel played his hand. He told me to let them put the hollow crown on their heads." Silas took a step back, the umbrella shifting slightly, allowing the freezing rain to hit my face once again. He looked at me, a sharp, dangerous smile finally breaking across his stoic features. "He knew they would do this, Chloe. It is time to tell them who you really are." Without another word, Silas turned and walked calmly back to his town car, his dark silhouette blending seamlessly into the violent storm. The heavy doors clicked shut. The engine purred and the town car glided smoothly out of my way, disappearing down the long, winding driveway. I sat alone in the driver's seat, the engine humming beneath me, gripping the wax-sealed envelope as the storm raged in the darkness. I tore into the heavy parchment. The thick crimson wax shattered, scattering tiny red fragments across the center console of my car. Inside the envelope, my fingers brushed against a stack of densely packed legal documents and a small, cold titanium flash drive. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my leather work tote, pulling out my laptop. I rested it on the steering wheel, the glow of the screen casting a pale blue light against the dark, rain-streaked windows of my car. I inserted the drive. While the system recognized the external device, I flicked on the overhead cabin light and turned my full attention to the physical paperwork in my lap. The header on the first page was printed in bold, uncompromising black ink. Declaration of Irrevocable Trust. The Phoenix Trust. I scanned the date at the bottom of the page. It was executed exactly 5 years ago. My forensic accounting brain instantly shifted into overdrive, automatically translating the dense legal jargon into raw, undeniable reality. Grandpa Jeremiah had not died without a will. He had done something infinitely more cunning. He had bypassed the probate courts entirely. For the last 5 years, he had been quietly and methodically transferring 85% of his actual wealth into this blind trust. I flipped through the itemized schedules, my eyes widening with every page. Liquid assets, massive commercial real estate portfolios, high-yield offshore holding accounts, and the lucrative intellectual property rights to the logistics software that powered the entire Washington empire. He had moved all of it out of his personal name and locked it safely inside the ironclad vault of the Phoenix Trust. A chilling, brilliant realization washed over me. I quickly turned my attention to the laptop screen, clicking open the master corporate structural files loading from the flash drive. I needed to see exactly what was left in the primary corporate entity, the flagship company my father had just so proudly handed over to Julian in front of 300 elite guests. I pulled up the consolidated balance sheets, my eyes trained by a decade of forensic audits and ruthless corporate tax structuring, devoured the data across the digital columns. A sharp involuntary laugh escaped my throat, echoing loudly in the quiet cabin of my car. They inherited a ghost. The Washington Logistics Corporation, the glittering jewel of our family name, was nothing but a hollowed-out shell. Grandpa Jeremiah had systematically stripped it of all its actual value. What remained in that specific corporate entity was staggering operational debt. The toxic high-interest loans Julian had casually accrued over the years, the highly leveraged equipment leases, the massive overhead costs, and the bloated executive expense accounts. It was all neatly packaged inside the entity Julian now legally controlled as the newly minted CEO. My father and my brother were inside that mansion right now, clinking crystal glasses and accepting the blind admiration of Atlanta's high society. They were celebrating their absolute ownership of a sinking ship. They had just thrown me out into the rain, stripping me of my title and my dignity to protect a mountain of crushing liabilities. My father, Bishop Ezekiel Washington, a man who demanded absolute submission from everyone in his orbit, had just anointed his golden boy with a crown of thorns and debt. I turned back to the physical documents in my lap, my hands shaking slightly as I flipped past the financial schedules to the beneficiary designation page. I read the clauses once, twice, 3 times, making absolutely sure the legal phrasing was impenetrable. It was flawless. I was named as the sole executor and the singular primary beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust. I owned the trust, and the trust owned everything else. I flipped to the property annexes. My breath caught in my throat, and the cold, damp chill in my bones vanished, replaced by a searing electric heat. The Phoenix Trust held the master deeds to every physical piece of land the family occupied. I owned the commercial plots downtown. I owned the sprawling manicured acreage of the Washington family estate. I owned the very ground my father's 10,000-member megachurch was built upon. I looked up through the rain-soaked windshield at the glowing windows of the primary master suite on the second floor of the mansion. Brittany was up there right now. She was probably directing the household staff to unpack her designer clothes, claiming her new territory, fully believing she had successfully evicted me from her kingdom. She had handed me garbage bags with a smug smile on her face, completely unaware she was handing them to the singular owner of the very ground she stood on. I was her landlord. I owned the roof over her head, the hardwood floor beneath her feet, and the marble pulpit my father used to cast his public judgment upon me. I directed my attention back to the laptop screen. Nestled among the dense financial spreadsheets and scanned property deeds on the flash drive was a single video file. The file name was simply a date, the exact date of Grandpa Jeremiah's last birthday. I double-clicked the icon. A stark black security prompt immediately popped up on the screen demanding a password. There was no hint, no security question, just a blinking white cursor waiting for the right key. I did not even have to think about it. Grandpa Jeremiah was a man of fierce faith and even fiercer business principles, but he only had one quote framed in gold on the wall of his private study. It was a verse he made me memorize and recite to him when I was 10 years old, long before I ever understood the weight of money or the cruelty of family. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and typed out the verse. Proverbs 13:22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. I hit the enter key. The security prompt vanished instantly. The media player expanded to fill the entire screen, casting a bright glow across the dashboard. The black background faded away, and suddenly my grandfather's sharp, familiar face appeared in the pale light of my car. The screen flickered once, a bright flash of digital static illuminating the cramped, damp interior of my sedan, before settling into the crisp, high-definition resolution of a recorded video. My breath hitched. There, sitting behind his massive hand-carved mahogany desk, in the very study I had spent thousands of hours reviewing spreadsheets with him, was Grandpa Jeremiah. He looked slightly younger than the man we had just buried, his skin a bit more flush, his posture rigid and unyielding. He wore his signature charcoal gray suit, looking every bit the ruthless titan of industry who had clawed his way up from the red clay of Georgia. The ambient sound of my car engine and the relentless driving rain hammering against my windshield faded into the background as the audio from the video kicked in. My grandfather leaned forward, folding his weathered hands on the desk. He looked directly into the camera lens with a piercing, predatory intensity that made me instinctively sit up straighter in my driver's seat. "If you are watching this," Chloe, my grandfather's deep, gravelly voice echoed through the car speakers, "it means my heart has finally given out. It also means your father has played the exact hand I always knew he would. I am recording this private directive 5 years before the doctors tell me I am running out of time, because a wise man prepares for war long before the first shot is fired." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he could actually see me sitting in the freezing rain, soaking wet and banished from the only home I had known. "I have spent the last 5 years watching you," Chloe Jeremiah continued, his tone devoid of any soft grandfatherly sentiment. It was pure, unadulterated business. "I watched you catch the $1 million embezzlement in our regional logistics division when Julian completely missed it because he was too busy vacationing in Monaco on the corporate card. I watched you restructure our commercial real estate acquisitions, maneuvering through tax loopholes to save this family millions in capital gains, all while Ezekiel was busy ordering custom silk robes for his pulpit and demanding more funding for his megachurch vanity projects. I saw every late night. I saw every sacrifice. I saw you surrender your 20s to protect a legacy that the men in this family took for granted." My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. The sheer overwhelming validation washing over me was intoxicating. For 10 years, I had believed my grandfather merely tolerated my presence in the boardroom, using my financial brilliance because it was convenient. I had never realized he was quietly observing, judging, and measuring my worth against the monumental incompetence of my father and brother. "Ezekiel loves the spotlight," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping into a register of profound disgust. "He builds absolutely nothing, but he believes he is owed the world simply because he can preach a good sermon and command a stage. And Julian loves the lifestyle. He is a parasite who treats this corporation like an endless personal ATM, possessing zero understanding of the blood and sweat required to keep those accounts funded. But only my Chloe respects the grind." A single tear mixed with the rainwater already streaking down my face. I gripped the steering wheel, hanging onto every single syllable. "I knew they would try to crush you the second my heart stopped beating," Jeremiah stated, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. "I knew that the moment I was out of the picture, their fragile masculine egos would completely take over. Ezekiel could never tolerate a woman holding the reins of the Washington Empire, let alone a daughter who is infinitely smarter than he could ever hope to be. I knew they would cast you out. I knew they would try to erase you from the narrative and take all the credit for the wealth you secured. So I decided to let them have exactly what they wanted." Jeremiah gestured toward the edge of his desk, presumably pointing toward the physical stack of documents that currently rested on my lap. "Over the last 5 years, I established the Phoenix Trust," he explained, a slow, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "And every single time you brilliantly negotiated a new warehouse acquisition, I had my private attorneys transfer the master deed out of the flagship corporation and directly into the blind trust. Every time you secured a lucrative supply chain contract, I routed the intellectual property rights and the holding accounts into the trust. I systematically stripped the Washington Logistics Corporation of every single asset of actual value right under your father's arrogant nose." He leaned forward again, his eyes burning with a dark, triumphant fire. "The empire Ezekiel just proudly handed to your brother is a hollowed-out carcass. It holds absolutely zero liquid assets. It holds nothing but the operational debt. They inherited the toxic high-interest loans Julian recklessly signed off on. They inherited the massively leveraged equipment leases. They inherited the bloated executive pensions your father demanded. They are currently celebrating their absolute ownership of a sinking ship. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning as the monumental scale of his legal trap clicked into place. My grandfather had weaponized my brother's incompetence against him. You are the sole executor and the primary beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust, Jeremiah commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You own the commercial plots downtown. You own the master deed to the sprawling estate they are currently sleeping in. You own the very ground Ezekiel's 10,000-member megachurch is built upon. You are their landlord, Chloe. You hold the keys to their survival, and you hold the power of their destruction. He reached forward, his hand hovering near the camera to end the recording. Let them put the crown on their heads, Chloe. Jeremiah whispered his final words, echoing in the cramped space of my car. Let them feel the weight of the debt. Let them boast and brag to high society, completely unaware that they are standing on a trapdoor. You are the only one ruthless enough and smart enough to keep this empire alive. The video cut to black. The sudden silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, heavy drumming of the rain against the metal roof. The pale blue light of the blank laptop screen cast long shadows across my face. I sat perfectly still for a long time, the cold, damp chill that had settled into my bones entirely eradicated by the searing electric heat of absolute power. I looked down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my lap. The Phoenix Trust. I ran my fingers over the crisp embossed paper. Brittany had handed me a box of heavy-duty garbage bags, smugly declaring that she was moving into the primary master's suite. Ezekiel had publicly humiliated me, declaring that a woman's place was to support, not to lead. Julian had cowardly looked at the floor, perfectly content to steal a decade of my labor to fund his lavish lifestyle. They believed they had buried me. They had no idea they had just handed a shovel to the sole owner of their entire existence. I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The screen snapped shut, plunging the interior of the car into darkness. I looked up through the rain-soaked windshield at the glowing, towering windows of the Washington estate. I could still see the faint moving silhouettes of the guests inside, drinking my grandfather's expensive liquor and celebrating a fraudulent king. A slow, dangerous smile crept onto my face. I would not march back inside. I would not kick down the heavy oak doors and wave the Phoenix Trust documents in their faces. That would be too easy. That would give them time to scramble, time to hire lawyers, time to beg for mercy. No, I was going to honor my grandfather's final request. I was going to let Julian sit in the CEO's chair just long enough for the corporate creditors to start calling. I was going to let Ezekiel preach his prosperity gospel from a pulpit he no longer owned. I was going to play the long game. I shifted the car into drive, ready to pull out of the estate and head toward a hotel downtown to strategize my next move. Suddenly, the tense silence was shattered by a harsh, aggressive vibration against the center console. The bright screen of my phone lit up the dark cabin. I glanced down. It was a text message from Julian. The harsh, aggressive vibration against the center console shattered the absolute stillness inside my car. The bright screen of my phone lit up the dark cabin, illuminating the tiny fragments of crimson wax scattered across the leather seats. I glanced down. The caller ID flashed brightly through the gloom. Julian. I sat perfectly still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic, heavy slap of the windshield wipers pushing the freezing rain away. My brother had incredible timing. Barely an hour into his reign as the newly minted CEO of Washington Logistics, and he was already reaching out to the sister he had just publicly humiliated. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to build, savoring the absolute shift in power that he was completely unaware of. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing even and controlled. Well, look who actually packed up and ran away. Julian slurred, his voice thick and syrupy with expensive scotch and unearned victory. Through the speaker, I could hear the deafening thumping bass of the sound system Ezekiel had undoubtedly hired for the repass. The clinking of crystal glasses and the shrill, overlapping laughter of Atlanta's high society echoed in the background. They were treating my grandfather's funeral like a coronation gala. What do you want, Julian? I asked, my voice flat, betraying absolutely zero emotion. Do not use that tone with me, Chloe. He snapped the alcohol, amplifying his natural arrogance. I am your boss now. I am the head of this family. You are just a bitter ex-employee who could not handle the reality of the corporate hierarchy. I called because you left a mess on your way out the door, and I need you to clean it up. I leaned back against the driver's seat, my eyes drifting to the heavy stack of Phoenix Trust documents resting on my passenger seat. What kind of mess? Brittany was a little stressed about the move, Julian explained, his tone shifting into a sickeningly proud gloat. You know how she gets with dust and packing boxes. The whole vibe of the guest house eviction put her in a bad mood. So as my first official executive action as CEO of Washington Logistics, I decided to boost company morale. I bought her a welcome home present. I closed my eyes, a dark, cynical amusement bubbling up in my chest. You bought her a present. A custom Porsche 911 Turbo, Julian bragged, emphasizing every single syllable to ensure the price tag registered in my mind. Black on black. Fully loaded. I had the dealership source it from their flagship lot in Miami. They are ready to load it onto a transport truck tonight, so it is sitting in the driveway by the time she wakes up tomorrow. $200,000, Chloe. That is what real executive power looks like. I could hear Brittany shrieking in the background, her high-pitched voice cutting through the heavy bass of the music. Tell her to hurry up, babe. The transport driver charges by the hour. There is just one tiny administrative roadblock. Julian continued, letting out a frustrated sigh. I swiped the black corporate executive card, the one tied to the primary operational account. But the dealership's finance department flagged the transaction. They said there is an archaic security protocol on the corporate escrow line for any purchase over $50,000. The system is demanding the master vendor authorization password to clear the wire transfer overnight. He paused, expecting me to immediately jump to attention. When I remained completely silent, his voice hardened into a cold, demanding bark. I know you set up that firewall, Chloe. Give me the master vendor login. Now. I stared out through the rain-streaked windshield, watching the warm yellow lights spilling from the windows of the grand estate. Julian was 32 years old, holding the title of Chief Executive Officer, and he genuinely believed a corporate credit card was a magic wand. He had spent his entire life shielded from the brutal reality of business finance. He had never looked at a balance sheet. He had never audited a vendor ledger. He simply swiped a piece of plastic and expected the world to bow. He had absolutely no idea how Grandpa Jeremiah had structured the hollowed-out shell company he just inherited. My mind raced through the financial annexes I had just read on the flash drive. The Washington Logistics Corporation did not possess a massive liquid escrow account anymore. Jeremiah had drained it entirely into the Phoenix Trust. To maintain the illusion of wealth for Ezekiel and Julian, Jeremiah had replaced the liquid capital with highly leveraged, toxic operational debt. The black corporate card Julian was currently waving around at a luxury car dealership was not backed by corporate cash. It was backed by a bridging loan, and according to the new succession bylaws explicitly outlined in the document sitting next to me, the moment Julian accepted the title of CEO, the corporate veil dissolved. Any new debt authorized on that specific executive line bypassed the company entirely. It bypassed the trust. It required a direct binding personal guarantee from the acting executive. By entering that master password to force the transaction through, Julian was not spending company money. He was legally authorizing a personal unsecured loan for $200,000 at a ruinous interest rate. He was putting the debt directly onto his own back. Are you listening to me? Julian shouted into the phone, his frustration boiling over. Do not play games, Chloe. Dad is standing right here. If you do not give me that password right now, I will have the corporate lawyers freeze your personal checking accounts. I will strip whatever pathetic severance you think you are entitled to. Give me the damn login. I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us. I wanted him to feel my hesitation. I wanted him to believe he was breaking me down, forcing me into submission one final time. I wanted him to feel the absolute thrill of dominating his older sister. You are the CEO now, Julian, I said, forcing my voice to sound defeated. small and entirely broken. You are right, it is your company. You make the decisions. A loud, victorious bark of laughter erupted from the speaker. That is what I thought, Julian sneered, his ego swelling to massive proportions. I am glad you finally know your place. Now send the password. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I opened my messaging app and opened my text thread with Julian. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. I typed out the complex alphanumeric sequence that controlled the master vendor authorization gateway. 14 characters, 14 keystrokes that would officially sign his financial death warrant. I hit send. A second later, I heard the sharp ping of the notification coming through on his end of the line. Got it, Julian said, his voice dripping with supreme satisfaction. I am forwarding this to the finance manager right now. Maybe if you play nice and apologize to Brittany tomorrow, we will let you wash it for us. Do not forget to leave the guest house keys under the mat. He did not even wait for a response. He hung up the phone, cutting the line dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The screen went dark, plunging the car back into the cool blue shadows of the storm. The rain continued to pound against the roof, a relentless driving rhythm that matched the hammering of my heart. I looked over at the thick wax-sealed envelope and the titanium flash drive resting on the passenger seat. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his study 5 years ago, meticulously designing a trap that relied entirely on the arrogance of his own son and grandson. He knew they would demand the crown. He knew they would spend the money. I leaned back against the headrest, staring up at the grand estate through the dark, rain-slicked glass. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across my face, stretching from ear to ear. I rolled up my window, sealing out the freezing wind and the noise of the storm. Enjoy the ride, Julian, I whispered into the empty, quiet car. I hope you bought gap insurance because you just attached that debt to your personal Social Security number. The transition from the violent rain, soaked driveway of the Washington estate to the pristine climate-controlled air of the 42nd floor of the Bank of America Plaza took exactly 1 week. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my newly leased corner suite, looking down at the sprawling, sunlit concrete grid of downtown Atlanta. The space was massive, aggressively modern, and unapologetically expensive. I had spared absolutely no expense outfitting the headquarters of my new independent forensic accounting firm. The Phoenix Trust, completely unburdened by the crushing operational debt my father and brother were currently drowning in, possessed capital reserves that were practically bottomless. I had used a tiny fraction of that liquidity to secure this fortress. The walls were soundproofed, the security systems were military-grade, and the heavy mahogany desk resting in the center of the room was larger than the one my grandfather used to occupy. For 7 days, I had operated in absolute terrifying silence. I ignored my father's furious, demanding emails. I blocked the frantic, confused text messages from the corporate accounting department. I simply sat in this gleaming tower and watched the digital tripwires I had set begin to snap one by one. I was in the middle of reviewing the highly classified restructuring documents for a massive overseas acquisition when the heavy glass doors of my suite swung violently open. The pneumatic hinges hissed in loud protest against the sudden aggressive force. I did not flinch. I slowly looked up from my documents, keeping my hands perfectly still on the desk. Julian and Brittany marched into the reception area, completely ignoring the shocked protests of my newly hired executive assistant. They moved with the synchronized, aggressive swagger of people who genuinely believed the world owed them a red carpet. Julian wore a sharply tailored navy suit that looked like it had been slept in. His tie was slightly askew, and his eyes were shadowed by the unmistakable hollow exhaustion of a man who was quietly realizing he was in far over his head. Brittany, however, looked like she had just stepped off a runway. She was draped in head-to-toe designer labels, clutching a pristine white Birkin bag like a shield, her heels clicking sharply against my imported marble floors. They bypassed the reception desk entirely and stormed straight into my private office. Brittany slammed her manicured hands down on the edge of my desk, leaning over the mahogany surface with a look of absolute venomous triumph. "You need to start packing your boxes right now." Chloe, Brittany demanded, her voice echoing shrilly against the soundproof walls. And leave the high-end computer monitors. Those belong to us. I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I folded my hands perfectly in my lap. I did not offer them a seat. To what do I owe the pleasure of this unannounced intrusion? I asked, my voice calm, flat, and entirely unbothered by her theatrics. Do not play dumb with us, Julian spat, stepping up beside his wife. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to project the authority of a CEO, but his posture was defensive, almost brittle. We know exactly what you are doing. You think you can just get evicted from the family estate, steal our corporate clients, and set up a rival accounting firm right in the middle of downtown. We own the Washington Logistics Corporation. That means we own you. Brittany pulled a stack of crumpled, hastily printed legal papers from her designer bag and threw them across my desk. They scattered over my meticulously organized files, disrupting the perfect symmetry of my workspace. Our lawyers found the original drafts of your business plans, Brittany sneered, a vicious, mocking smile stretching across her face. We know you started conceptualizing this independent firm 3 years ago, and we know you used your company-issued laptop to type up the initial incorporation documents. According to the strict intellectual property clauses in the standard Washington corporate employment contract, anything you create using company resources is the legal property of the holding company. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice into a tone of dripping toxic condescension. You thought you were so clever sneaking around behind Ezekiel's back. But you are just a bitter spinster who could not secure a ring, so you are trying to steal our family money to make yourself feel important. You have no husband, you have no family, and now you have no business. Washington Logistics is seizing this entire operation. Every client, every piece of software, every piece of furniture in this ridiculous suite belongs to Julian. Hand over the access codes, grab your purse, and get out before we call the police and have you arrested for corporate espionage. I sat there in the pristine silence of my office, letting her vile, deeply personal insults hang in the air. A bitter spinster. A thief. This was the narrative they had constructed to comfort themselves. They genuinely believed my entire existence was defined by my lack of a husband and my desperate need to steal their wealth. They had spent their entire lives coasting on the hard work of others, completely insulated by Grandpa Jeremiah's brilliant financial shielding, and they truly thought the real world operated on country club gossip and hollow legal threats. I shifted my gaze from Brittany's triumphant sneer to Julian's face. I studied him closely. Beneath the arrogant bluster, beneath the forced corporate swagger, I saw the microscopic tremors of pure panic. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. His skin looked slightly gray under the bright LED office lights. He was sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning circulating through the building. He did not look like a triumphant CEO seizing a rival asset. He looked like a man who was currently drowning in invisible water. I knew exactly why. Exactly. The $200,000 Porsche he had bought Brittany a week ago using the master vendor password was just the beginning. By forcing that transaction through the newly restructured executive escrow line, he had inadvertently triggered the collapse of the corporate veil. The banks holding the massive toxic operational debt of Washington Logistics had instantly received an automated notification that the new CEO had assumed personal liability for the company's bridging loans. Over the last 7 days, while he was busy drinking and celebrating his new title, Julian's personal social security number had been systematically hammered by the corporate creditors. He had not come here to seize my company because of a laptop. He had come here because he was desperate. He was terrified. He needed the liquid cash he assumed I was hoarding to stop the bleeding, and he was using his wife as a blind attack dog to get it. I did not argue with Brittany's absurd legal theories. I did not defend my personal life. I did not raise my voice or react to the venom she had just spit in my face. Arguing with people who were economically bleeding to death was a complete waste of breath. Instead, I smoothly rolled my chair forward. I reached across the scattered, meaningless papers Brittany had thrown on my desk and picked up my sleek silver iPad. I tapped the screen, the biometric scanner instantly recognizing my fingerprint. "Julian," I said softly, ignoring Brittany entirely. Have you checked your personal credit score this morning? Julian flinched. It was a tiny microscopic twitch of his shoulders, but in the quiet room it was as loud as a gunshot. The arrogant sneer on his face faltered, replaced by a sudden stark look of absolute terror. He uncrossed his arms, his hands dropping dead to his sides. "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, his voice suddenly lacking any real conviction. "This has nothing to do with my credit score. This is about you stealing corporate property." I smiled. It was the same slow, dangerous smile I had worn in the rain-soaked car a week ago. I tapped the screen of my iPad again, bypassing the standard accounting software and opening the highly encrypted, heavily guarded application for the master banking portal. The screen glowed bright white as the system connected directly to the offshore holding accounts of the Phoenix Trust. The harsh, fluorescent glare of the digital banking portal illuminated the sharp angles of my face. The interface was a masterpiece of custom financial architecture, a fortress of encrypted accounts routing numbers and offshore holding balances that represented the true, staggering wealth of Grandpa Jeremiah's life work. Julian and Brittany stood on the opposite side of my mahogany desk, completely oblivious to the digital guillotine I was about to drop on their necks. Brittany scoffed, planting her hands firmly on her hips. She leaned forward, the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, catching the light. "Did you hear a single word I just said, Chloe? Or are you too busy playing solitaire on company time? I told you to start packing." Julian is the chief executive officer of Washington Logistics. He owns this building. He owns the chair you are sitting in. He owns the intellectual property of whatever sad little bookkeeping firm you are trying to launch here. We are taking it all. I did not look up from the screen. My fingers danced gracefully across the glass, executing a sequence of complex authorizations. I tapped into the primary executive ledger. "You do not own this building, Brittany," I said, my voice calm, maintaining the steady conversational cadence of a professor explaining basic arithmetic to a toddler. "I lease this suite under a completely independent LLC, fully funded by private capital that Washington Logistics has absolutely no claim to. And as for your ridiculous theory about a 5-year-old company laptop giving you ownership of my firm, you might want to ask your husband to actually read the corporate bylaws instead of just using them as a coaster for his scotch." Julian slammed his hand flat on my desk, the sudden violent sound echoing off the soundproof walls. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "Do not talk down to my wife," Julian barked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You have been playing these arrogant mind games for 10 years, Chloe. You always thought you were the smartest person in the room just because Grandpa let you play with his spreadsheets. But Grandpa is dead. Dad is in charge of the estate, and I am in charge of the corporation. You have absolutely nothing. Now hand over the iPad and get out before I call building security and have you physically thrown onto the street." I finally lifted my gaze. I looked past his pointing finger, past the forced aggressive posturing, and locked eyes with my brother. The bravado was entirely superficial. Beneath the expensive suit and the designer haircut, Julian was a terrified, fragile man. His breathing was shallow and uneven. A fine sheen of cold sweat glistened on his forehead. He was running entirely on fumes and blind entitlement. I set the iPad down flat on the desk, rotating it exactly 180 degrees so the screen faced them perfectly. "I am not playing mind games, Julian," I said softly, leaning forward. "I am playing a completely different sport, and you just scored an own goal." Julian's eyes darted down to the screen. Brittany leaned in beside him, her brow furrowing in confusion as she stared at the complex web of financial data. "Let us talk about your first week as CEO." I continued, keeping my tone perfectly level. "A week ago, you called me from the estate. You were drunk. You were celebrating. You bragged that you had just purchased a $200,000 custom Porsche for Brittany using the primary executive credit line. You were so incredibly proud of yourself. You thought you were flexing your new corporate muscle. You demanded the master vendor authorization password because the dealership's finance department flagged the transaction." "That is right," Julian sneered, puffing his chest out. "I am the CEO. I have unlimited signing authority. The corporate account can handle a drop in the bucket like a Porsche." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, predatory grin of a hunter watching a trap snap shut. Washington Logistics does not have a corporate account. Julian, I stated, enunciating every word with deliberate precision. Washington Logistics is a hollow shell. Grandpa Jeremiah spent the last 5 years legally bleeding the flagship company dry. He moved every single dollar of liquid capital, every valuable real estate deed, and every profitable contract into an irrevocable blind trust. The Phoenix Trust. The only thing left inside the company you just inherited is the operational debt. You inherited $50 million in liabilities, high-interest loans, and equipment leases. Julian's face went entirely slack. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a ghost. He shook his head, a weak denial-driven laugh escaping his throat. "You are lying," he stammered, stepping back from the desk. "That is impossible. Dad said the company is worth hundreds of millions. The corporate credit lines are active. I just use them. I bought the car. I bought Brittany's new diamonds yesterday. The cards worked. They worked because they were collateralized by a subsidiary holding company," I explained, tapping a specific line item on the glowing screen. Apex Holdings. Apex Holdings was the financial safety net Grandpa set up to keep the credit lines open and maintain the illusion of wealth for you and Dad. But there is a catch, Julian. Apex Holdings is wholly owned by the Phoenix Trust. And as of midnight on the day Grandpa died, I became the sole executor and primary beneficiary of the Phoenix Trust. Brittany's mouth dropped open. She looked from me to Julian, her manicured hands gripping her designer bag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Julian, what is she saying? What does that mean?" "It means," I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my arms, "that the corporate credit line you have been swiping all week requires a corporate guarantor. But Washington Logistics has no cash to guarantee it. The moment you bypassed the security protocol at the dealership using the master password I cheerfully sent you, the system updated. By using that specific override code, you legally bypassed the corporate structure and signed a personal guarantee." Julian stopped breathing. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a sudden suffocating horror. "You did not spend company money, Julian," I said, driving the final nail into the coffin. "You authorized a personal, unsecured loan for a $200,000 sports car. You tied the debt for the car, the diamonds, the lavish dinners, and the hotel suites directly to your personal Social Security number. You are personally on the hook for every single cent you have spent since Grandpa died." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, crushing silence of total financial annihilation. Then Julian's pocket vibrated. It was a harsh, sharp buzz. Then another, then 3 more in rapid succession. The sound cut through the quiet office like a siren. Julian flinched violently. He reached into his tailored suit jacket with a trembling hand and pulled out his smartphone. The screen was a chaotic waterfall of aggressive notifications. I could see the red alert banners flashing even from across the desk. Brittany leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the screen. Her breath hitched in her throat in a loud, panicked gasp. "Julian!" She shrieked, her voice skyrocketing into pure hysteria. "Why is American Express texting you? Why does it say the transaction at the jeweler was reversed? Julian, there are 6 fraud alerts. It says your accounts are frozen. Julian, what is happening?" Julian stared at his phone, his thumb swiping frantically at the screen, desperately trying to refresh his banking apps. He tapped his personal checking account. He tapped the joint savings account. Every single screen flashed the same brutal, uncompromising message. Insufficient funds. Account locked pending creditor review. Margin call initiated. He dropped the phone onto the desk. It clattered against the wood, the screen still flashing a sea of red warnings. He looked up at me, his chest heaving, his eyes begging for a punchline to a joke that was never going to come. "You did this," Julian whispered, his voice cracking, completely stripped of his earlier arrogance. "You locked the accounts. You cut off the credit." I reached out and placed my index finger on the iPad screen, resting it gently over the master control icon. "I did not make you swipe the card, Julian," I replied softly, my gaze locking onto his terrified eyes. I just removed the safety net you never earned. You and Dad wanted to run the empire without me. You told me a woman's place was to support, not to lead. So I am letting you lead. I am letting you navigate the crushing weight of the operational debt you accrued. I am letting you explain to Dad why the holding company is seizing the family estate tomorrow morning to cover your personal liabilities. Brittany let out a loud, shuddering sob. She took a massive step away from Julian, looking at him as if he were suddenly infected with a terminal disease. Her dream of endless wealth and high society dominance had just evaporated in the span of 3 minutes. She was married to a man who possessed nothing but millions in high-interest debt. I tapped the button on my screen. A final definitive chime echoed from the iPad as the system locked the remaining executive gateways. I just canceled the company credit cards, I said, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. And Julian, you might want to look out the window. Julian dragged his feet across the plush carpet, moving toward the massive pane of floor-to-ceiling glass, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly turned to quicksand. Brittany was right on his heels, her breath coming in short, erratic bursts. They peered down at the street level of the Bank of America Plaza, their eyes frantically scanning the crowded downtown concrete 42 stories below. The mid-morning Atlanta sun reflected blindingly off the glass and steel of the surrounding skyscrapers, but it was incredibly easy to spot the source of their new nightmare. Parked illegally across the designated VIP valet lane was a massive heavy-duty flatbed tow truck. Its bright amber light bars were flashing aggressively, casting a harsh rhythmic glare against the polished stone pillars of the building entrance. The heavy steel winch was already in motion. Attached to the thick chains slowly being dragged up the steep slanted incline of the flatbed was a gleaming brand-new black-on-black Porsche 911 Turbo. Brittany let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a high-pitched guttural shriek of absolute unadulterated horror. My car. Brittany screamed, her voice shattering the quiet sophistication of my office suite. Julian. They are taking my car. She did not wait for his response. She dropped her $200,000 attitude and her pristine white Birkin bag directly onto my floor. She spun around and sprinted out of my private office, tearing through the reception area with zero regard for decorum. The frantic rapid-fire clicking of her designer heels echoed down the corridor as she bolted toward the elevator bank, frantically hammering the call button to get down to the plaza level. Julian remained frozen at the window. His hands were pressed flat against the glass, his entire body trembling violently. He was watching his fragile, unearned empire evaporate into thin air piece by piece right before his eyes. I did not move to join him at the window. I simply reached across my desk, picked up a sleek remote control, and pointed it at the massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of my office. With a single click, I bypassed the standard news channels and routed the feed directly to the building's exterior security cameras. As the primary leaseholder of the penthouse suite, I had insisted on premium access to the plaza's surveillance grid. The screen flickered to life in brilliant high-definition color. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and gestured toward the television. "You do not have to strain your neck, Julian," I offered cheerfully. "We have a front row seat right here." Julian turned slowly from the window, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the screen. We watched in utter silence as the lobby doors on the ground floor flew open. Brittany burst onto the pavement, teetering dangerously on her stilettos, her designer dress flying wildly around her legs. She lunged toward the tow truck driver, a burly man in a neon safety vest, who was casually securing the rear axles of the Porsche with heavy industrial straps. On the screen, we watched Brittany physically grab the man's arm, tears streaming down her face, her mouth moving in frantic, desperate pleas. The driver did not even flinch. He calmly shook off her grip, reached into the cab of his truck, and pulled out a bright yellow carbon copy of a legal document. He shoved the immediate repossession order directly against her chest. Brittany stumbled backward as if she had been physically struck. She dropped to her knees right there on the dirty oil-stained concrete of the valet lane. A crowd of downtown professionals, corporate bankers, and curious pedestrians had already formed a circle around the spectacle. Half a dozen people had their smartphones out recording the wife of the newly minted CEO of Washington Logistics weeping on the pavement over a repossessed sports car. The footage would be circulating on every single high society blog and gossip page in Atlanta before the tow truck even merged onto the interstate. The driver climbed into the cab, pulled the air horn once, and merged into the heavy downtown traffic, taking the $200,000 symbol of Julian's arrogance with him. Julian stared at the television screen, his face completely devoid of color. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he finally found his voice. How did they move so fast? Julian choked out, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and disbelief. I just bought it. The ink on the dealership paperwork is barely dry. When you trigger a multi-million-dollar corporate margin call by attaching a toxic personal guarantee to a frozen account, the creditors do not send you a polite warning letter in the mail. I explained, maintaining the cold clinical tone of a forensic auditor. They execute algorithmic repossession protocols instantly. The bank algorithm flagged your gross lack of liquidity the second you swiped the card. They dispatched the recovery team before you even woke up this morning. By tomorrow afternoon, they will begin freezing your personal assets to cover the depreciation gap of the vehicle. I suggest you tell Brittany to stop crying and start gathering her jewelry because the creditors are coming for those new diamonds next. Julian stumbled away from the television, looking around the pristine, impenetrable fortress of my office as if the walls were closing in on him. He collapsed into one of the leather guest chairs opposite my desk, burying his face in his trembling hands. Chloe. Please, Julian whispered, the arrogance entirely stripped away, replaced by the pathetic, desperate whining of a child who had finally broken his favorite toy. We are family. You cannot do this to me. I am your brother. If you lock these accounts, I am dead. I will be bankrupt by Friday. Dad will lose the estate. You have to unlock the Phoenix Trust. You have to give the money back to the holding company. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, heavy finality. You did not consider us family when you stood on that stage and let Ezekiel publicly humiliate me, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. You did not consider us family when you watched him throw me out into the rain so you could play king of a castle you did not build. You stole a decade of my labor to fund your vacations, Julian. You happily wore the crown. Now you get to wear the debt. Julian's head snapped up. Panic completely overrode his common sense. He lunged for his pocket, pulling out his smartphone with shaking hands. He bypassed the endless stream of fraud alerts and insufficient funds notifications and pulled up his contact list. I am calling. Dad, Julian threatened, his voice rising in pitch as he desperately sought the protection of the only authority figure he had ever relied on. When Ezekiel finds out you are holding the family money hostage in some secret trust, he is going to destroy you. He will bury this little accounting firm before you even secure your first client. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Go ahead, I challenged. Put him on speaker. Julian slammed his phone onto the mahogany surface, his finger violently jabbing the speakerphone icon. The dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet room. It rang twice before the deep, booming, theatrically polished voice of Bishop Ezekiel Washington filled my office. Julian, my father answered, his tone dripping with supreme, untouchable confidence. Tell me you have finished clearing out your sister's little bookkeeping suite. I have a board of directors meeting at noon, and I want the legal confirmation that we have seized her intellectual property before I sit down. Dad? Julian gasped, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. Dad, it is gone. Everything is gone. Ezekiel paused. The smooth pastoral charm vanished from his voice, instantly replaced by a sharp, dangerous edge. What are you talking about, Julian? What is gone? The money, Julian cried, completely abandoning any pretense of executive control. The corporate accounts, the holding company liquidity. Chloe does not just have a new office, Dad. She has everything. Grandpa Jeremiah stripped Washington Logistics. He put the cash, the real estate deeds, and the vendor contracts into a blind trust, and he made Chloe the sole executor. The company I just took over is completely bankrupt. A heavy, suffocating silence radiated from the speakerphone. I could practically hear my father's mind racing desperately, trying to calculate how a man he had buried a week ago had managed to reach beyond the grave and snap his neck. Dad, they just towed Brittany's car from the plaza, Julian babbled, completely unraveling. The bank froze my personal accounts. We do not have the capital to cover the operational loans. We cannot even make payroll on Friday. Chloe locked us out. Ezekiel exhaled a long, measured breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer directed at Julian. It was aimed directly at me, carrying the full, terrifying weight of a narcissist who had just realized he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Chloe, my father, said, the sheer venom in his tone vibrating through the speaker. I know you are sitting there listening to this. I am right here, Ezekiel, I replied, refusing to afford him the respect of his paternal title. You listen to me very carefully, you arrogant, ungrateful little girl. Ezekiel snarled, the holy facade dropping to reveal the ruthless tyrant beneath. You are going to log back into whatever fraudulent trust account your grandfather illegally established, and you are going to transfer every single dime back to the flagship corporation. You will surrender the real estate deeds. You will surrender the vendor contracts. If you think you can stage a hostile takeover of my family legacy, you have severely miscalculated. Your family legacy currently consists of $50 million in toxic liabilities, I corrected smoothly. And unfortunately for you, the Phoenix Trust is legally impenetrable. The ink has been dry for 5 years. You have absolutely no leverage. I have an empire, Ezekiel roared, abandoning all composure. I have a congregation of 10,000 fiercely loyal followers. I have the mayor, the city council, and every major corporate executive in Atlanta on my speed dial. I built the Washington name in this city, and I can tear it down just as easily. He took a ragged breath, his voice dropping into a dark, terrifying promise. If you do not wire that money by the end of the business day, I will dedicate my entire existence to your absolute ruin. I will drag your name through the mud from the pulpit of my church to the front page of the business journal. I will make sure every client you try to solicit knows you are a thief who robbed her own family. If you want war, Chloe, I will turn this entire city against you. You won't be able to buy a cup of coffee in this town. I stared down at the phone, listening to the heavy, furious breathing of a man who was completely empty-handed and trying to fight with shadows. I did not feel fear. I did not feel the crushing, oppressive weight of his authority that had kept me in line for 28 years. I felt utterly invincible. I leaned directly into the microphone of Julian's phone. Bring it, Bishop. I reached out and hit the glowing red button on the screen, cutting the line dead. I sat back in my chair, looking at my brother's shattered expression, entirely ready for the fallout. The Sunday morning following my brother's spectacular financial implosion arrived with the blinding, aggressive clarity of a Georgia summer. I was seated at my mahogany desk in the Bank of America Plaza, miles away from the sprawling 50-acre campus of the Covenant Fellowship megachurch. The suite was perfectly silent, the heavy soundproof doors sealing me off from the rest of the world. But I did not need to be sitting in the velvet-lined front pew to feel the shockwave my father was preparing to unleash. I had the high-definition live stream projected directly onto my wall monitor. My father stepped up to the massive custom-poured acrylic pulpit. The theatrical stage lighting immediately tracked his movement, catching the subtle, expensive gleam of his tailored burgundy suit. Behind him, a 200-person choir swayed in perfect unison, their voices slowly fading into a low, harmonious hum as he raised his hands. 10,000 people sat in absolute rapt silence. Bishop Ezekiel Washington was a master of grand theater. He knew exactly how to modulate his voice, how to build a sweeping emotional crescendo, and how to weaponize ancient scripture to settle his modern personal vendettas. Today his target was me. He began softly pacing the width of the sprawling stage. He spoke about the sacred, unbroken order of the family, the divine mandate placed upon sons to carry the heavy legacy of their fathers, and the inherent destructive dangers of modern rebellion. Then his voice dropped an octave. It grew darker, heavier, resonating through the stadium-quality sound system with an undeniable, threatening edge. He pivoted sharply, staring directly into the main broadcast camera. "There is a spirit moving through our homes," Ezekiel thundered, his voice cracking with manufactured righteous agony. "A dark, rebellious spirit. The Jezebel spirit. It whispers poison into the ears of our women. It tells them that the divine order of this world is outdated. It breeds ungrateful, greedy daughters who covet the throne of men." The congregation erupted in a rolling chorus of amens and applause. The camera panned across the crowd, showing thousands of people nodding in fervent agreement. They had absolutely no idea they were actively cheering for the public destruction of his own flesh and blood. "They will smile in your face while plotting in the shadows to steal the very foundation you built with your own 2 hands." Ezekiel shouted, a single bead of sweat tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "They will try to tear down their own brothers. They will use deceit, financial trickery, and toxic worldly independence to humiliate the men God has specifically anointed to lead. But we must cast out the Jezebel. We must starve that spirit of rebellion until it falls to its knees, repents, and submits to the righteous order of the family." The broadcast cut to a wide-angle shot as the congregation rose to a standing ovation. I reached out and tapped the mute button on my desk remote. The silence of my 42nd floor office suddenly felt incredibly heavy, thick with the unspoken implications of what I had just watched. Ezekiel was not just preaching a Sunday sermon to a room of faithful believers. His congregation was the beating heart of Atlanta's Black elite. Those 10,000 seats held city council members, regional bank managers, commercial real estate developers, and top-tier corporate executives. He was sending a massive, blinding flare up into the sky, signaling to the entire Atlanta business community that Chloe Washington was officially a pariah. He was declaring an absolute social and economic embargo. The financial blockade was swift, merciless, and terrifyingly efficient. Monday morning, the polished glass doors of my forensic accounting firm remained perfectly intact, but the digital barricades slammed down by exactly 9 o'clock. I was in the middle of reviewing a tax mitigation strategy when my private desk phone rang. It was Marcus Vance, the CEO of a mid-sized commercial freight company and my most lucrative independent client. I had personally saved his firm over $3 million in tax liabilities during the previous fiscal quarter. "Marcus," I answered, keeping my tone bright, steady, and entirely professional. "I was just reviewing your quarterly projections. We are on track to maximize the new depreciation schedules," Chloe Marcus replied. His voice was incredibly stiff, entirely lacking its usual booming warmth. "I am going to keep this brief. We are terminating our retainer with your firm effective immediately. My legal team will forward the standard cancellation paperwork and settle the final invoice by noon." I sat up straight, my analytical brain instantly searching for a logical numbers-based breach. "Marcus, is there an issue with the recent audits? If this is about the restructuring fee we discussed last week, we can easily negotiate those terms." "It is not about the fee," he cut me off, his tone dropping into a low, distinctly uncomfortable register. "Look, Chloe, you are a brilliant accountant. You know I believe that. But I sit on the elder board at Covenant Fellowship. I attended the bishop's private leadership breakfast this morning before heading into the office. My company relies heavily on the community network and the zoning board connections your father facilitates for us. I cannot have my company's financials tied to a woman who is currently under a massive cloud of moral and character concerns within our community. It is bad for business." He hung up the phone before I could utter a single syllable of defense. Character concerns. My father had actively painted me as an unstable, treacherous thief, and the business community was swallowing the narrative whole just to protect their own standing within his empire. Less than an hour later, my second largest client, a boutique commercial real estate firm run by a woman I considered a mentor, called to pull her accounts. She did not even have the courage to speak to me directly. She had her executive assistant read a coldly prepared legal statement, citing a sudden shift in corporate direction. When I demanded to speak with her, the assistant nervously admitted that her boss had received a direct phone call from Ezekiel's pastoral office earlier that morning. 2 hours, 2 phone calls. 40% of my projected independent operating revenue was entirely wiped off the ledger. I stood up from my desk and walked slowly to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling sunlit city. Ezekiel was brilliantly demonstrating his raw, unchecked power. He knew he could not touch the offshore accounts of the Phoenix Trust. He knew he could not reverse the crushing operational debt Julian had recklessly signed his personal name to. But my father controlled the social and economic ecosystem of Atlanta. He was showing me that all the untouchable capital in the world meant absolutely nothing if I was entirely isolated, blacklisted, and starved of local clients. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to feel the walls of my expensive silent office closing in on me. He wanted me to realize that fighting the Washington patriarchs meant going to war with the entire city. The glass was cool against my forehead. I took a deep, stabilizing breath, refusing to let the sharp sting of betrayal cloud my judgment. They expected me to break. They expected me to crumble under the insurmountable weight of the mountain Ezekiel had just casually dropped on my shoulders. They believed I was just a bitter spinster playing a game I could not possibly win. A sharp, demanding buzz vibrated aggressively against the mahogany wood of my desk. I turned around. My smartphone screen was illuminated, displaying a single unread text message. I walked over, picked it up, and swiped open the notification. It was from Ezekiel. He never texted anyone. He believed digital communication was a menial task far beneath a man of his stature, leaving those duties entirely to his staff. The fact that he had typed this message himself proved exactly how desperately he wanted to twist the knife and assert his dominance. I read the words glowing against the bright white background of the screen. Apologize to your brother, sign over your firm to the family, and I will restore your good name. A family must protect its men. I stared at the text, the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his demand washing over me. He was not asking for a compromise. He was not offering a truce. He was demanding total, unconditional surrender. He wanted me to crawl back to the estate, hand over the keys to the financial fortress I had built, and bow down to Julian's staggering incompetence just to maintain the pristine illusion of his perfect male-led dynasty. He wanted me to save them from their own ruin, and he wanted me to thank him for the absolute privilege of doing so. A cold, sharp laugh escaped my throat, echoing loudly in the empty, soundproof suite. My father genuinely thought he had cornered me. He thought cutting off my local clients would drain my resources, break my spirit, and force my hand. He had completely forgotten the cardinal rule of forensic accounting that Grandpa Jeremiah had drilled into my head since I was a teenager. You never show your enemies your entire ledger. The harsh, aggressive vibration against the center console shattered the absolute stillness inside my car. The bright screen of my phone lit up the dark cabin, illuminating the tiny fragments of crimson wax scattered across the leather seats. I glanced down. The caller ID flashed brightly through the gloom. Julian. I sat perfectly still for a moment, listening to the rhythmic, heavy slap of the windshield wipers pushing the freezing rain away. My brother had incredible timing. Barely an hour into his reign, as the newly minted CEO of Washington Logistics, and he was already reaching out to the sister he had just publicly humiliated. I let it ring 3 times, allowing the tension to build, savoring the absolute shift in power that he was completely unaware of. I pressed the green accept button and lifted the phone to my ear, keeping my breathing even and controlled. Well, well, well. Look who actually packed up and ran away. Julian slurred, his voice thick and syrupy with expensive scotch and unearned victory. Through the speaker I could hear the deafening thumping bass of the sound system Ezekiel had undoubtedly hired for the repass. The clinking of crystal glasses and the shrill, overlapping laughter of Atlanta's high society echoed in the background. They were treating my grandfather's funeral like a coronation gala. What do you want, Julian? I asked, my voice flat, betraying absolutely zero emotion. Do not use that tone with me, Chloe. He snapped, the alcohol amplifying his natural arrogance. I am your boss now. I am the head of this family. You are just a bitter ex-employee who could not handle the reality of the corporate hierarchy. I called because you left a mess on your way out the door, and I need you to clean it up. I leaned back against the driver's seat, my eyes drifting to the heavy stack of Phoenix Trust documents resting on my passenger seat. What kind of mess? Brittany was a little stressed about the move. Julian explained, his tone shifting into a sickeningly proud gloat. You know how she gets with dust and packing boxes. The whole vibe of the guest house eviction put her in a bad mood. So as my first official executive action as CEO of Washington Logistics, I decided to boost company morale. I bought her a welcome home present. I closed my eyes, a dark, cynical amusement bubbling up in my chest. You bought her a present? A custom Porsche 911 Turbo. Julian bragged, emphasizing every single syllable to ensure the price tag registered in my mind. Black on black. Fully loaded. I had the dealership source it from their flagship lot in Miami. They are ready to load it onto a transport truck tonight, so it is sitting in the driveway by the time she wakes up tomorrow. $200,000, Chloe. That is what real executive power looks like. I could hear Brittany shrieking in the background, her high-pitched voice cutting through the heavy bass of the music. Tell her to hurry up, babe. The transport driver charges by the hour. There is just one tiny administrative roadblock, Julian continued, letting out a frustrated sigh. I swiped the black corporate executive card, the one tied to the primary operational account. But the dealership's finance department flagged the transaction. They said there is an archaic security protocol on the corporate escrow line for any purchase over $50,000. The system is demanding the master vendor authorization password to clear the wire transfer overnight. He paused, expecting me to immediately jump to attention. When I remained completely silent, his voice hardened into a cold, demanding bark. I know you set up that firewall, Chloe. Give me the master vendor login, now. I stared out through the rain-streaked windshield, watching the warm yellow light spilling from the windows of the grand estate. Julian was 32 years old, holding the title of Chief Executive Officer, and he genuinely believed a corporate credit card was a magic wand. He had spent his entire life shielded from the brutal reality of business finance. He had never looked at a balance sheet. He had never audited a vendor ledger. He simply swiped a piece of plastic and expected the world to bow. He had absolutely no idea how Grandpa Jeremiah had structured the hollowed-out shell company he just inherited. My mind raced through the financial annexes I had just read on the flash drive. The Washington Logistics Corporation did not possess a massive liquid escrow account anymore. Jeremiah had drained it entirely into the Phoenix Trust. To maintain the illusion of wealth for Ezekiel and Julian, Jeremiah had replaced the liquid capital with highly leveraged, toxic operational debt. The black corporate card Julian was currently waving around at a luxury car dealership was not backed by corporate cash. It was backed by a bridging loan. And according to the new succession bylaws explicitly outlined in the document sitting next to me, the moment Julian accepted the title of CEO, the corporate veil dissolved. Any new debt authorized on that specific executive line bypassed the company entirely. It bypassed the trust. It required a direct binding personal guarantee from the acting executive. By entering that master password to force the transaction through, Julian was not spending company money. He was legally authorizing a personal unsecured loan for $200,000 at a ruinous interest rate. He was putting the debt directly onto his own back. Are you listening to me? Julian shouted into the phone, his frustration boiling over. Do not play games, Chloe. Dad is standing right here. If you do not give me that password right now, I will have the corporate lawyers freeze your personal checking accounts. I will strip whatever pathetic severance you think you are entitled to. Give me the damn login. I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us. I wanted him to feel my hesitation. I wanted him to believe he was breaking me down, forcing me into submission one final time. I wanted him to feel the absolute thrill of dominating his older sister. You are the CEO now, Julian, I said, forcing my voice to sound defeated, small and entirely broken. You are right. It is your company. You make the decisions. A loud, victorious bark of laughter erupted from the speaker. That is what I thought. Julian sneered, his ego swelling to massive proportions. I am glad you finally know your place. Now send the password. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I opened my messaging app and opened my text thread with Julian. My thumbs hovered over the digital keyboard. I typed out the complex alphanumeric sequence that controlled the master vendor authorization gateway. 14 characters. 14 keystrokes that would officially sign his financial death warrant. I hit send. A second later, I heard the sharp ping of the notification coming through on his end of the line. Got it, Julian said, his voice dripping with supreme satisfaction. I am forwarding this to the finance manager right now. Maybe if you play nice and apologize to Brittany tomorrow, we will let you wash it for us. Do not forget to leave the guest house keys under the mat. He did not even wait for a response. He hung up the phone, cutting the line dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. The screen went dark, plunging the car back into the cool blue shadows of the storm. The rain continued to pound against the roof, a relentless driving rhythm that matched the hammering of my heart. I looked over at the thick wax-sealed envelope and the titanium flash drive resting on the passenger seat. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his study 5 years ago, meticulously designing a trap that relied entirely on the arrogance of his own son and grandson. He knew they would demand the crown. He knew they would spend the money. I leaned back against the headrest, staring up at the grand estate through the dark, rain-slicked glass. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across my face, stretching from ear to ear. I rolled up my window, sealing out the freezing wind and the noise of the storm. Enjoy the ride, Julian, I whispered into the empty, quiet car. I hope you bought gap insurance because you just attached that debt to your personal Social Security number. I stared at the glowing text message from my father. Apologize to your brother, sign over your firm to the family, and I will restore your good name. A family must protect its men. The sheer blinding arrogance of his demand was almost poetic. Ezekiel genuinely believed he had backed me into an inescapable corner. He thought that by weaponizing his pulpit and executing a coordinated social embargo, he could starve me out of the city. He expected me to dissolve into a puddle of tears, pack up my pristine new office, and crawl back to the Washington estate on my hands and knees. He expected me to be the obedient, terrified daughter he had spent 28 years trying to mold. I did not cry. I did not capitulate. I did not even bother typing out a response. I simply set the phone face down on my desk, silencing his digital bluster, and reached for my primary workstation keyboard. My father was a master manipulator of human emotion, but he possessed a fatal glaring weakness. He was technologically illiterate. Both Ezekiel and Julian operated with a staggering level of digital incompetence. For the better part of a decade, they had treated the complex financial software that ran their respective empires like magic boxes. They routinely ignored security protocols, shared passwords with junior assistants, and blindly signed digital authorization documents without ever reading the underlying metadata. They only cared about the final numbers on the front-facing dashboard. They never once bothered to look under the hood. But I built the hood. 3 years ago, when Covenant Fellowship expanded its campus and required a massive overhaul of its internal bookkeeping software, Ezekiel had forced me to handle the integration. He refused to pay an outside tech firm, claiming it was a waste of church resources, when he had a perfectly capable financial analyst living under his roof. I spent 6 months meticulously migrating the megachurch's antiquated ledgers into a custom cloud-based vendor portal. And because I knew my father and brother would inevitably lock themselves out of the system or accidentally delete critical tax files, I coded a deep structural administrative loophole into the architecture of the platform. It was a backdoor access key disguised as a defunct vendor registration gateway. They never knew it existed, and when they threw me out of the family, they were far too busy celebrating to hire a cybersecurity firm to revoke my administrative credentials. I cracked my knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet, soundproof suite. I opened a sterile browser window and typed in the encrypted URL for the Covenant Fellowship vendor portal. The familiar login screen appeared, displaying the glittering gold logo of my father's megachurch. I bypassed the standard username fields and executed a specific string of keyboard commands, bringing up the hidden developer console. I typed in my master backdoor credentials and hit enter. The security firewall instantly dissolved. The screen refreshed, granting me total, unadulterated access to the raw, unfiltered general ledgers of the Covenant Fellowship megachurch. I did not leave my office for the next 48 hours. I locked the heavy glass doors of my suite shut, the motorized blinds to block out the distraction of the Atlanta skyline, and ordered my executive assistant to hold all calls. I practically lived on black coffee and sheer adrenaline-fueled spite. I pulled up multiple monitors, dividing the massive streams of financial data into manageable chronological blocks. Forensic accounting is not just about finding missing money. It is about understanding the psychological profile of the person moving the money. You have to learn their patterns. You have to spot the tiny microscopic deviations in their spending habits. I started with the operational expenses. I traced the massive utility bills for the church campus, the payroll ledgers for the pastoral staff, and the bloated marketing budgets for my father's televised sermons. Everything in the primary accounts looked perfectly clean. Ezekiel was too smart to steal directly from the operational fund. He knew those numbers were subject to routine mandatory audits by the internal church elders. If he was hiding something, he was burying it deep. I switched my focus to the vendor disbursement files. This was where the real financial warfare took place. I spent 14 hours cross-referencing every single invoice paid out over the last 5 years. I hunted for ghost accounts, fake consulting firms, and offshore transfers disguised as charitable outreach programs. I pulled the corporate registration records for every contractor the church had hired to fix the roof, pave the parking lots, and upgrade the audiovisual equipment. My eyes burned from staring at the bright monitors. My shoulders ached from sitting perfectly rigid in my chair. But the deeper I dug, the more the digital dirt began to surface. I started finding heavily redacted invoices tied to shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. Millions of dollars were bleeding out of the church through vague, poorly defined consulting fees, and every single one of those fraudulent invoices bore the digital signature of Bishop Ezekiel Washington. But the consulting fees were just the appetizers. I needed the main course. I needed something so massive, so undeniably corrupt, that it would completely annihilate my father's untouchable reputation. At 2 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday, my cursor hovered over a highly restricted, heavily encrypted subfolder buried at the very bottom of the Capital Campaign's ledger. The title of the folder made my breath catch in my throat. The Covenant Fellowship New Youth Center Building Fund. I sat up straight, instantly wide awake. This was the Holy Grail. For the last 3 years, Ezekiel had relentlessly preached about the urgent need to build a state-of-the-art youth center for the underprivileged children of Atlanta. He had launched a massive, aggressive fundraising campaign. He had pressured the wealthiest members of the congregation to donate 6-figure sums. He had held special telethons passing the collection plates an extra 3 times during every single Sunday service, pleading with single mothers and working-class families to empty their pockets for the children. The congregation had poured their hearts and their savings into that specific account. But the physical construction of the youth center had mysteriously experienced endless delays. Ezekiel continually blamed zoning issues, supply chain shortages, and corrupt city inspectors. The groundbreaking ceremony had been pushed back 4 times. I clicked on the restricted folder. The system demanded a secondary authorization code. I quickly ran a brute force script using my backdoor credentials, shattering the encryption in less than 20 seconds. The folder opened, spilling its contents across my primary monitor. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The jackpot was staring right back at me. I pulled up the incoming donation logs and placed them side by side with the outgoing wire transfers. The numbers were staggering. Over the last 36 months, the Congregation of Covenant Fellowship had generously donated $12.5 million specifically designated for the new Youth Center Building Fund. But the current balance in the account was less than $40,000. I frantically traced the outgoing wires. The money had not gone to architects. It had not gone to construction crews. It had not gone to city zoning boards. Ezekiel had systematically siphoned $12 million out of the Sacred Youth Fund. He had chopped the massive sum into dozens of smaller structured wire transfers to avoid triggering federal banking alerts. He had routed the money through a labyrinth of shell companies, eventually depositing the stolen congregation funds into a completely untraceable private offshore account registered in the Bahamas. My father was not just a narcissist. He was not just a misogynist who believed women were second-class citizens. He was a colossal, unapologetic fraud. He had looked into the eyes of his most vulnerable, trusting followers and robbed them blind to pad his own secret retirement fund. I leaned back in my chair, the stark, undeniable proof of his criminal empire glowing brightly on my screens. Ezekiel thought he could destroy me by calling a few wealthy clients and questioning my character. He thought he could ruin my reputation and force me into submission. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the digital blueprints to his prison cell. I reached for my phone, unlocked the screen, and opened the text thread with my father. I did not type out a long emotional paragraph. I did not demand an apology for his sermon. I simply took a high-resolution screenshot of the offshore wire transfers draining the youth fund and attached the image to the message. I hit send, completely ready to watch the bishop fall. The silence in my office after hitting send was absolute. It was a heavy, pregnant stillness, the kind that precedes a catastrophic detonation. I left my smartphone face up on the mahogany desk, fully expecting the screen to immediately light up with a frantic, rage-induced phone call from my father. I anticipated the aggressive buzzing, the barrage of threats, the sheer panic of a man who had just realized his invincible armor was made of glass. The phone remained completely dark. Ezekiel was suffocating in his own terror. But a seasoned forensic accountant knows better than to stop at the first layer of deception. Finding a secret offshore account in the Bahamas was certainly enough to destroy my father's pristine pastoral reputation. But it did not answer the fundamental underlying question. Why would a man who already controlled a massive tax-exempt megachurch empire need to hoard $12 million in a tropical tax haven? Ezekiel was obsessed with power and public adoration. He craved the spotlight. A secret retirement fund did not fit his psychological profile. He did not hoard wealth. He weaponized it. I turned my chair back to the glowing wall of monitors. I cracked my knuckles again, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet room, and dove straight back into the digital labyrinth. The Bahamian account was not a vault. It was a transit hub. I began running trace route algorithms on the outgoing disbursements from the offshore shell company. If Ezekiel was siphoning money out of the Covenant Fellowship New Youth Center Building Fund, he was doing it to feed a massive localized financial black hole. It took me exactly 3 hours of relentless caffeine-fueled coding to bypass the offshore privacy walls and follow the money trail right back to American soil. The offshore account had systematically executed 64 separate wire transfers over the last 3 years. Every single dollar had been routed back into a network of domestic, limited liability companies registered in Delaware and Nevada. I ran the employer identification numbers through a proprietary corporate database I maintained for high-level audits. The primary managing director for every single one of those domestic shell companies was Julian Washington. I stared at the screen, a dark, cynical laugh escaping my chest. My father had not been stealing from his congregation to enrich himself. He had been staging an elaborate multi-million-dollar rescue mission for his golden boy. I opened the operational ledgers for Julian's LLCs. The first company, Apex Digital Solutions, was an absolute bloodbath. It was a cryptocurrency mining and trading venture Julian had confidently launched 2 years ago. The ledgers revealed a staggering level of financial incompetence. Julian had bought into wildly speculative algorithmic trading platforms at the absolute peak of the market. When the crypto bubble burst, he lost $4 million in a matter of weeks. The second company, Quantum Horizon Investments, was an unregulated venture capital fund Julian used to back doomed tech startups run by his equally incompetent fraternity brothers. That vanity project had burned through another $5 million. Julian had not simply failed at business. He had driven his independent ventures into catastrophic, unrecoverable ruin. And every single time the margin calls came due, every single time his creditors threatened to drag him into bankruptcy court, Ezekiel stepped in. My father had quietly authorized massive withdrawals from the church donation funds, scrubbing the wire transfers through the Bahamian account and dumping the clean cash directly into Julian's failing businesses to keep the Washington family name out of the bankruptcy ledgers. Ezekiel had stood at his acrylic pulpit, looking down at single mothers, working-class mechanics, and elderly pensioners living on fixed incomes, begging them to empty their pockets to build a sanctuary for impoverished youth. He had taken their hard-earned devotion and handed it directly to his son to cover the losses of speculative digital currency. But Julian's staggering failures only accounted for $9 million. There was still a massive gaping hole in the overall embezzlement scheme. I isolated the remaining $3 million and tracked the corresponding wire codes. These funds had not been routed into corporate structures. They had been funneled directly into a domestic trust titled the Washington Administrative Expansion Initiative. It sounded incredibly official, exactly the kind of line item an internal church auditor would gloss over without a second thought. I pulled the expense reports for the Administrative Expansion Initiative. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of the disbursements made my stomach turn. The church had not expanded its administrative capabilities. The church had completely subsidized Brittany Washington's high society lifestyle. I scrolled through hundreds of individual transactions. Ezekiel had used the stolen congregation funds to pay for Brittany's quarterly private jet charters to Paris and Milan. He had authorized church checks to cover her exorbitant six-figure tabs at exclusive Buckhead jewelry boutiques, categorizing the diamonds in the church ledger as event staging materials. He had paid for her custom wardrobe updates, her private country club memberships, and the sprawling, lavish renovations to her personal guest house on the family estate. My father had delivered a fiery, aggressive sermon condemning greedy, ungrateful women who coveted the resources of men. He had weaponized his religion to socially ostracize me for daring to demand my rightful financial independence. Meanwhile, his chosen daughter-in-law was literally wearing clothes paid for by the Sunday collection plates. I had everything I needed. The Phoenix Trust was a brilliant defensive maneuver executed by my grandfather. But this new discovery was an offensive weapon of mass destruction. I organized the raw data into crystal-clear, indisputable spreadsheets. I generated high-resolution charts tracing the exact flow of the money from the hands of the Covenant Fellowship congregation through the Bahamian Transit Hub directly into Julian's failed crypto accounts and Brittany's designer shopping sprees. I highlighted every single fraudulent signature belonging to Ezekiel Washington in bright, undeniable crimson. I routed the compiled dossier to the heavy-duty industrial laser printer sitting in the corner of my office suite. The machine instantly woke up. The low mechanical hum filled the room, followed by the rhythmic, repetitive sound of the paper feeders engaging. I sat back and listened to the glorious sound of my father's empire being systematically reduced to undeniable printed evidence. Hundreds of pages began stacking up in the output tray, carrying the distinct sharp scent of warm toner and absolute ruin. As the printer continued to churn out the documents, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed against the thick frosted glass of my office door. I swiveled my chair around. A courier dressed in a pristine black uniform stood in the reception area. He looked entirely out of place in the sleek, modern austerity of my forensic accounting firm. He was holding a sleek digital clipboard in one hand and a thick, heavy black envelope in the other. I unlocked the security partition from my desk console and walked out to the reception area. The courier offered a polite, practiced smile. "Delivery for Chloe Washington," the young man said, extending the digital clipboard. "Sign here, please." I dragged my finger across the glass screen and accepted the envelope. The paper was incredibly thick, textured with a high-quality matte finish. It possessed the unmistakable heavy weight of exorbitant wealth. I thanked the courier and waited until the glass door clicked shut behind him before breaking the seal. I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the contents. It was a massive custom-pressed invitation card. The edges were dipped in genuine gold leaf. The elegant sweeping calligraphy, embossed in the center of the dark cardstock, caught the overhead lights of my office, glittering with an aggressive, boastful pride. I read the text aloud, the sheer irony of the words practically burning my tongue. The Washington Legacy Gala. Bishop Ezekiel Washington cordially invites you to a night of supreme elegance and family triumph, celebrating the official ascension of Julian Washington to Chief Executive Officer of Washington Logistics. I stared at the heavy gold lettering. My father and my brother were completely out of their minds. Their corporate accounts were frozen. Their operational credit lines were generating massive daily penalty fees. Julian had legally attached $200,000 of high-interest automotive debt to his personal Social Security number. Ezekiel had just received a text message proving I possessed direct knowledge of his offshore embezzlement scheme. And their response to this total impending financial apocalypse was to throw a multi-million-dollar coronation party for the entire city of Atlanta to witness. They were doubling down on the illusion. They honestly believed that if they threw a grand enough gala, if they packed the ballroom with enough politicians, local celebrities, and corporate elites, they could project an aura of total invincibility. They wanted to force me to watch Julian wear the crown. They wanted to publicly cement my isolation and secure their dominance before the financial floor completely collapsed beneath their feet. The printer in my office finally ceased its rhythmic churning. The silence returned to the suite, punctuated only by the faint, distant hum of the downtown traffic 42 stories below. I walked back into my private office and stood in front of the massive output tray. The stack of paper was nearly 3 inches thick. It was the definitive comprehensive execution order for the Washington Patriarchs. I picked up the black and gold invitation, placing it gently on top of the stack of damning financial ledgers. The contrast between their glittering superficial lie and the harsh black and white truth of their crimes was absolutely perfect. I turned away from the desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The afternoon sun had dipped behind the neighboring skyscrapers, casting long, dramatic shadows across the polished glass of my office. I looked at my reflection in the window. My posture was perfectly straight. My eyes were completely clear, devoid of the fear and the desperate need for approval that had plagued my 20s. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the executioner. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out a sleek gold tube. I removed the cap, twisted the base, and carefully applied a fresh coat of bold, unapologetic red lipstick. I pressed my lips together, smoothing the vibrant color, and met my own gaze in the glass. Oh, I wouldn't miss my brother's coronation for the world. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was a masterclass in opulent, unapologetic excess. Massive crystal chandeliers cascaded from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. The room was packed shoulder to shoulder with the absolute zenith of Atlanta's elite. State politicians, corporate tycoons, local celebrities, and the entire senior deacon board of the Covenant Fellowship megachurch held crystal flutes of vintage champagne, completely mesmerized by the spectacle unfolding on the elevated stage. My father stood behind an illuminated acrylic podium, gripping the edges with his large manicured hands. He was in his element, radiating the magnetic, overpowering charisma that had built his empire. The massive screens behind him projected a stylized gold leaf crest of the Washington family name. To my right stands a young man who has proven himself worthy of the heaviest mantle a father can pass down. Ezekiel's voice boomed through the stadium-quality acoustic system, wrapping the ballroom in his velvet baritone. Julian is not just a son, he is a visionary. He represents the unyielding future of Black excellence. Today we do not just celebrate his ascension to the head of Washington Logistics. We celebrate the continuation of a dynasty that will shape the economic landscape of this city for generations to come. The ballroom erupted into thunderous, sycophantic applause. On the stage, Julian stood tall, puffing out his chest inside his bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He offered a practiced, humble wave to the crowd, soaking in the unearned adoration. Beside him, Brittany was glowing. She wore a backless, diamond-encrusted gown that caught the stage lights with every slight movement, projecting the perfect image of a devoted, wealthy corporate wife. They looked invincible. They looked like royalty. They had absolutely no idea the guillotine was already falling. I pushed through the heavy, brass-studded double doors at the rear of the ballroom with enough force that the heavy wood slammed against the stopper guards. The sharp, violent sound cracked through the applause like a gunshot. The clapping instantly died. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the back of the room. The silence that swept across the grand ballroom was profound, heavy, and suffocating. I walked straight down the center aisle. I was not wearing the subdued conservative business suits my father had always demanded I wear to blend into the background. I wore a structured midnight blue couture gown with a sweeping asymmetrical train. The fabric moved like liquid armor. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders pulled back, my heels striking the polished marble walkway with a slow, predatory rhythm. I was not alone. Silas Montgomery, the most ruthless and feared corporate litigator in the state of Georgia, walked half a step behind my right shoulder. Flanking us were 4 private forensic auditors dressed in identical charcoal gray suits. Each of them carried a heavy locked titanium briefcase containing the printed, undeniable proof of my father's criminal empire. On the stage, Ezekiel's charismatic smile froze, morphing instantly into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. His eyes darted from me to Silas, recognizing the attorney immediately. Panic flared in my father's expression. He abandoned the microphone and aggressively snapped his fingers toward the side of the stage, signaling the private security detail he had hired to patrol the gala. The head of security, a massive, imposing former military contractor named Marcus, immediately stepped directly into my path. He planted his boots on the marble floor, crossing his thick arms over his chest, effectively blocking the center aisle. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the exiled daughter to be physically dragged out of the building. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace. I stepped right up to Marcus, stopping barely 6 inches from his chest. I looked up into his stoic face and offered a calm, icy smile. Marcus stared back at me. His eyes flicked down to Silas Montgomery, then back to my face. A slow, respectful understanding washed over his features. He uncrossed his arms, offered a curt, professional nod, and took a massive step to the side, clearing the aisle entirely. He pivoted on his heel and assumed a protective stance directly behind my auditors, turning his back on my father. Ezekiel gripped the acrylic podium so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a harsh, echoing whisper. "Marcus, remove her from this room immediately." I kept walking toward the stage, my voice carrying clearly through the silent, captivated crowd. "The Phoenix Trust pays his company's contract." "Dad," I said, the words slicing through the heavy air. "And as of midnight last week, I am the sole signatory on that account. You do not give the orders anymore." I reached the carpeted stairs leading up to the stage and ascended them with slow, deliberate grace. Julian was hyperventilating. A thick sheen of cold sweat had broken out across his forehead, ruining his perfectly powdered complexion. He took a stumbling step backward as I approached, his hand gripping a wireless microphone so tightly the plastic casing groaned. He tried to speak, tried to summon the arrogant, bullying tone he had used on the phone with me just days prior, but his throat betrayed him. He let out a weak, stammering sound. I stepped directly into his personal space. I reached out my manicured fingers, wrapping around the metal cylinder of the microphone. I stared dead into his terrified eyes and smoothly pulled the device right out of his trembling grip. The crowd below let out a collective, synchronized gasp. The sheer disrespect, the absolute dismantling of Julian's public authority was mesmerizing. I turned away from my brother and looked directly at the sound engineer frantically working the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. I gave him a single sharp nod. The brilliant stage lights instantly dimmed. The massive high-definition screens behind Ezekiel and Julian flickered, killing the gold-leaf Washington family crest. The ballroom was plunged into darkness for exactly 3 seconds before the screens flared back to life. The image of Grandpa Jeremiah filled the entire wall. He was sitting in his familiar oak-paneled study, wearing his favorite tweed cardigan. The recording was crystal clear, capturing the sharp, uncompromising intelligence in his dark eyes. He looked directly into the camera lens, radiating the kind of absolute authority Ezekiel had spent his entire life trying to mimic. "If you are watching this," Jeremiah's recorded voice boomed through the speakers, deep and resonant, "it means I am dead, and the vultures have already started circling my legacy." Ezekiel stumbled away from the podium, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man watching his own execution. I built the Washington Corporation with blood, sweat, and unrelenting discipline. Jeremiah continued, his voice filled with a heavy, bitter disappointment. But I watched my son Ezekiel abandon the work to chase the spotlight. He is a charlatan, a man who worships his own reflection while wearing the cloth of God, and he raised his son to be exactly like him. Julian is a hollow suit, a boy playing dress-up in a man's world entirely incapable of leading men or managing wealth. I will not allow a century of family labor to be squandered by fools. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Politicians and corporate titans stared at the screen, their mouths slightly open, watching the foundational myth of the Washington family burn to ash. Therefore, Jeremiah stated, leaning forward in his leather chair, I have legally dissolved the liquid assets of Washington Logistics. I have activated the Phoenix Trust. And I leave the entirety of my $150 million estate, every liquid asset, every real estate holding, and every profitable contract solely and exclusively to my granddaughter, Chloe Washington. She is the only one with the intellect, the spine, and the integrity to protect this legacy. The video feed cut to black. The stage lights slowly faded back up, illuminating the absolute devastation on the stage. Julian let out a desperate, reedy laugh. It sounded like the bleat of a cornered animal. He lunged for the microphone resting on the acrylic podium, his hands shaking violently as he addressed the murmuring, shocked crowd. "This is a joke," Julian stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the blank screens. "It is a fake video. My sister is a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin my night." He turned to me, his chest heaving, a manic, panicked smile stretching across his face. "You get a little trust fund, Chloe. So what? We still own the church. We still own the holding company. You have nothing but an old man's sympathy." I looked at my brother, feeling a deep, profound pity for his sheer ignorance. I slowly shook my head. I turned to Silas Montgomery. He unclasped one of the titanium briefcases and handed me a sleek, thick black folder. I walked over to the acrylic podium and slid the folder smoothly across the polished surface until it rested directly in front of Julian. "Actually, Julian," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the ballroom, "the holding company you inherited is not an empire. It is $12 million in toxic operational debt. And since you were in such a rush to buy luxury cars and diamonds this week, you signed the master vendor agreements without reading the corporate bylaws. You legally bypassed the corporate structure. You are personally liable for every single penny of that $12 million. You are entirely bankrupt." Brittany let out a sharp, piercing gasp. She physically recoiled from Julian, stumbling backward until her heels caught the edge of the stage monitor. She looked at her husband with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The realization slammed into her with the force of a freight train. The diamonds on her neck, the custom gown she was wearing, the lavish lifestyle she had married into it, was all funded by toxic debt. She was legally tethered to a man who possessed a negative net worth of $12 million. Julian stared down at the black folder, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like he was going to vomit right there on the stage. I did not give him time to recover. I turned my back on my brother and locked eyes with my father. Ezekiel was vibrating with rage, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest heaving. He was a trapped predator, realizing the trap was entirely of his own making. I tapped the control console on the podium. The massive screens behind us flared back to life, but this time they did not show a video. They displayed a stark, highly detailed, irrefutable financial spreadsheet. I looked out at the sea of faces in the ballroom. I locked eyes with the senior deacons of Covenant Fellowship. I found the local investigative journalist sitting in the press rows at the back of the room. "My father likes to talk about the spirit of greed," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "He likes to preach about the dangers of coveting wealth. Let us look at his definition of pastoral integrity." I pressed a button on the remote in my hand. The spreadsheet on the screen zoomed in, highlighting a specific, highly encrypted subfolder. Over the last 3 years, the faithful congregation of Covenant Fellowship donated $12.5 million to the new youth center building fund. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage. Single mothers, elderly pensioners, and hardworking families emptied their pockets to build a sanctuary for the children of this city. I clicked the remote again. The screen transitioned to a dizzying web of offshore wire transfers, domestic shell company registrations, and luxury vendor invoices. But that youth center was never built, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, hard register. Because Bishop Ezekiel Washington systematically siphoned $12 million out of that charity fund. He routed the money through a shell corporation in the Bahamas to completely subsidize Julian's failed cryptocurrency ventures and Brittany's private jet charters to Paris. Your sacrificial offerings paid for the diamonds currently resting on his daughter-in-law's neck. The ballroom exploded. It was a chaotic, deafening roar of absolute outrage. Senior deacons stood up from their tables, their faces twisted in fury, shouting toward the stage. Investors and politicians scrambled out of their chairs, desperately trying to put physical distance between themselves and the toxic fallout of the Washington family. The press row at the back of the room surged forward like a tidal wave, cameras flashing wildly, capturing the total catastrophic destruction of Atlanta's most powerful religious figure. Ezekiel took a step toward me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, violent hatred. He looked like he wanted to wrap his hands around my throat. I did not flinch. I stepped right into his personal space, tilting my head up to look him dead in the eyes. The noise of the rioting ballroom faded into the background. It was just me and the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I didn't just come to crash a party, Ezekiel, I whispered, ensuring the microphone caught every single icy syllable of my promise. I came to serve an eviction notice. This entire gala, the champagne, the caviar, the stage you are standing on, is being paid for by a stolen church credit card, and the federal fraud investigators are waiting for you in the lobby. The exact second the words left my lips, the distant piercing wail of police sirens bled through the heavy acoustic glass of the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom. The sound multiplied rapidly, wrapping around the perimeter of the luxury hotel like a tightening noose. The flashing red and blue lights began to strobe violently against the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, slicing through the warm, golden glow of the crystal chandeliers. The perfectly orchestrated illusion of the Washington family dynasty was collapsing in real time, set to the deafening soundtrack of approaching federal law enforcement. The heavy brass-studded double doors at the rear of the ballroom flew open. Half a dozen men and women wearing stark utilitarian windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped into the room. They moved with absolute chilling precision, their faces locked in expressions of professional indifference. They did not care about the bespoke tuxedos, the designer gowns, or the staggering net worth of the crowd. They parted the sea of Atlanta's elite like a knife cutting through silk, marching directly down the center aisle toward the stage. My father stood frozen behind the acrylic podium, the blood entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. For the first time in my 28 years of life, Bishop Ezekiel Washington was completely speechless. The booming theatrical baritone that had commanded 10,000 loyal followers, the voice that had routinely shattered my confidence and enforced his absolute patriarchal rule, had completely evaporated. Ezekiel Washington, the lead agent, announced, his voice amplified by the sheer stunned silence of the ballroom. We have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. Step away from the podium and place your hands behind your back. Ezekiel tried to summon his pastoral authority. He stood up straight, smoothing the lapels of his burgundy suit, and forced a patronizing, condescending smile. He reached out his hands in a placating gesture, treating the federal agents like unruly members of his congregation. There is a massive misunderstanding here, officers, Ezekiel said, his voice trembling slightly beneath the forced bravado. I am a pillar of this community. I am a man of God. If you will just allow me to contact my legal counsel, we can resolve this clerical error immediately. Do you know who I am? The lead agent did not even blink. He reached to his tactical belt, unclipped a pair of heavy silver handcuffs, and stepped onto the stage. We know exactly who you are, sir. the agent replied coldly. Turn around. The definitive click of the locking mechanism echoed through the ballroom, snapping the spell that had held the crowd captive. Absolute chaos erupted. The senior deacons of the Covenant Fellowship megachurch, the men who had blindly followed my father's every command, physically turned their backs and rushed toward the side exits, desperately trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The state politicians and corporate tycoons who had gladly taken his money and his political endorsements literally shoved each other out of the way, fleeing the ballroom to avoid being photographed by the frantic press row. Julian was completely oblivious to the mass exodus. He was experiencing a catastrophic full-body system failure. My brother collapsed against the side of the acrylic podium, his legs giving out entirely. He sank to the polished wooden floor of the stage, his hands gripping his chest as he desperately gasped for air. He was hyperventilating, his chest heaving in rapid erratic bursts. The sheer magnitude of a $12 million personal debt had finally bypassed his staggering arrogance and crashed directly into his fragile reality. He was not a visionary. He was not a chief executive officer. He was an uneducated, deeply incompetent man who had just personally guaranteed the toxic financial waste of a completely bankrupt shell company. His custom Tom Ford tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. Brittany stood a few feet away, her diamond-encrusted gown glittering under the stage lights. She did not rush to her husband's side. She did not kneel on the floor to comfort him or offer a soothing hand. Instead, her eyes darted frantically across the stage, analyzing the scene with the cold, ruthless calculation of a predator assessing a dying host. She looked at Ezekiel, currently being read his Miranda rights, and physically marched down the center aisle in handcuffs. She looked at the massive financial ledgers still glowing brightly on the screens behind us, detailing the absolute, undeniable bankruptcy of the Washington estate. Finally, she looked down at Julian, who was weeping openly on the floor, clutching his chest. Brittany had never loved Julian. She had loved his stolen wallet. She had loved the private jet charters, the unlimited corporate credit lines, and the social dominance that came with the Washington name. The exact second the money dried up, the marriage was entirely void. Without a single word, Brittany reached over to her left hand. She gripped the massive 5-carat flawless diamond wedding ring Julian had purchased with siphoned church donations. She slid the heavy platinum band off her finger with one smooth, effortless motion. She dropped the ring onto the acrylic podium. The heavy stone landed with a sharp, resonant clink that cut right through Julian's panicked sobbing. Brittany picked up her designer clutch, stepped carefully over Julian's legs, and walked gracefully down the side stairs of the stage. She slipped out through the catering doors, abandoning my brother to face the financial firing squad entirely alone. I stood on the stage watching the federal agents escort my father out of the building. I watched the ballroom rapidly empty until nothing remained but overturned champagne flutes and the echoing silence of absolute ruin. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I had simply balanced the ledgers. The next morning, the bright Atlanta sun poured through the massive windows of my corporate headquarters. I had relocated my forensic accounting firm into a premium, highly secure high-rise suite in Midtown, utilizing the liquid capital from the Phoenix Trust to establish a fortress of modern efficiency. I sat behind my sprawling desk, quietly sipping a cup of black coffee, reviewing the transfer documents that officially consolidated my grandfather's entire empire under my direct control. A sharp, desperate knocking echoed through the heavy glass doors of my reception area. I glanced at the security monitors on my desk. Standing in the polished corridor outside my suite, flanked by two of my heavily armed private security guards, were the shattered remnants of the Washington patriarchs. Ezekiel had managed to post bail overnight, though the effort had undoubtedly drained whatever hidden secondary cash reserves he had left. He looked completely decimated. The immaculate burgundy suit was deeply wrinkled. He had been stripped of his pastoral title the moment the news broke, permanently exiled from the church he had built. Julian stood beside him looking even worse. His eyes were swollen and bloodshot, his hair disheveled, his posture entirely defeated. They looked exactly like what they were, two men who had lost absolutely everything. I tapped the intercom button instructing my security detail to let them in. Ezekiel and Julian shuffled into my office. They did not swagger. They did not attempt to command the room. They stood in front of my desk like beggars. Chloe. My father began, his voice a raspy, desperate shadow of its former glory. He placed his hands flat on my desk, leaning forward with pleading, frantic eyes. We have absolutely nothing. The creditors seized the estate this morning. The banks froze the remaining holding accounts. I am facing federal prison time, and your brother is drowning in $12 million of personal debt. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, meeting his gaze with absolute, unyielding indifference. I know Ezekiel. I am the one who printed the ledgers. Ezekiel's face twisted in agony. He resorted to the only weapon he had left in his arsenal. He attempted to play the ultimate manipulative emotional card. We are your blood, Chloe. Ezekiel pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. You have $150 million in that trust. You have the power to make this all go away. You can pay off Julian's creditors. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country to keep me out of prison. You have to save us. Family protects family. Julian nodded frantically beside him, tears welling up in his eyes. Please, Chloe. Brittany left me. I have nowhere to go. I will do whatever you want. I will sweep the floors in your office. Just wire the money. You are my sister. I set my coffee cup down on the desk. The ceramic clink sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room. I looked at the two men who had spent my entire life telling me that a woman's only purpose was to serve the ambitions of men. I looked at the father who had weaponized his religion to turn a city against me, and the brother who had gladly stolen my labor to fund his vanity. Blood makes you related, I said, my voice echoing with absolute icy calm. Loyalty makes you family. You two spent a decade proving exactly where your loyalty resided, and it was never with me. I stood up, resting my hands on the mahogany surface towering over them in my own corporate suite. Grandpa Jeremiah did not leave me his empire because he felt sorry for me. I continued enunciating every word with surgical precision. He left me his empire because he knew I would protect it from parasites. He knew I would not let his life's work be squandered by a fraud and a fool. You demanded the throne, and you got exactly what you asked for. Now you get to pay the bill. I reached out and pressed the red button on my intercom console. Find another accountant. My security team stepped immediately into the office, gripping Ezekiel and Julian by the arms. My father tried to shout, tried to hurl one last desperate curse, but the guards smoothly and forcefully marched them backward out of the suite, the heavy glass doors sliding shut and locking automatically behind them. I was finally permanently free. 6 months later, the justice of the universe settled into a perfectly balanced ledger. The trial of Ezekiel Washington was a spectacular media circus. Without the funds to hire top-tier legal defense, he was assigned a public defender who could do absolutely nothing against the mountain of irrefutable digital evidence I had provided to the federal prosecutors. He was found guilty on all counts of fraud and embezzlement. Julian's reality was arguably much worse. Without the protection of corporate bankruptcy, his $12 million personal debt resulted in the total liquidation of his life. He was stripped of his luxury cars, his designer wardrobe, and his high society status. The IRS aggressively garnished his wages, forcing him to take a minimum wage retail job at a big box hardware store just to make the mandatory minimum payments on his remaining liabilities. The man who had once mocked my bookkeeping firm was now wearing a polyester vest and sweeping floors in the lighting department. I stood on the expansive wrap-around balcony of my new skyscraper headquarters, the warm evening breeze catching the fabric of my dress. The Phoenix Trust was no longer a dormant defensive holding company. I had restructured the entire $150 million portfolio, transforming it into the most aggressive, successful venture capital firm in the Southeast. But I did not fund reckless crypto bros or arrogant men playing corporate dress-up. I exclusively funded technology and logistics startups, founded and led by minority women. I was building a new dynasty, one rooted in actual brilliance and relentless hard work. I looked out over the glittering, sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city that had briefly turned its back on me was now entirely illuminated by the companies I financed. I raised a crystal flute of vintage champagne, the bubbles catching the light of the setting sun. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I was completely independent, undeniably wealthy, and entirely free. The most profound lesson from this gripping story is that your true worth is never defined by the people who continually underestimate you, even if they are your own family. True security and power come from financial independence, relentless integrity, and building a solid foundation. Blood ties do not guarantee loyalty or respect. When you stop seeking validation from a toxic environment and instead focus heavily on your own personal growth, you become truly unshakable. Reclaiming your personal narrative is the ultimate victory. Share your inspiring story of overcoming toxic expectations and finding true independence in the comments section below.